Jaron Jarvis Channel, Top 20 Scary Stories of the Day from Reddit nosleep. 2018-08-19. Story 1, Don't get out of your car late at night, no matter what tries to stop you. When I was a 17-year-old moody teenager, I had a big argument with my mum one night about how she just didn't understand my needs and stormed out of the house. I was going to go for a walk, but it was freezing outside and really dark, so I did a quick walk of shame past my mum and grabbed my car keys, giving her a quick explanation of going on a Macca's run before storming out yet again, giving the door a nice slam on my way. I jumped in my terribly old and crappy bright red Suzuki Swift and cranked the heat, which made the engine scream in protest. I turned my angry teen music up and pulled out onto the dark streets. I drove to McDonald's in about 10 minutes and decided I was too mad to eat, and to calm down I would go on a nice drive. Just down the road another 15 minutes was a stretch of pitch black windy road that had lots of hairpin corners as it ran down a massive gorge to a small lake with a single lane bridge going across it. If that doesn't sound scary enough, the road was called the Galston Gorge. Fun facts, and you can Google this road, it's in Sydney, Australia. James Gibson's camera was found on this road. He was one of Ivan Milat's victims. The dude Wolf Creek was inspired by and one of Australia's worst serial killers, so it has a pretty creepy background and therefore is completely deserted at night. As I was making my way down the gorge, which is a road I know very well as I learned to drive on it with my mum, she took me a lot at night to learn night driving on a difficult road. I turned a hairpin corner, and as my headlights swung around it lit up the road ahead, and I saw a black medium-shaped object in the middle of the road. It made me jump, but I assumed it was just a dead kangaroo. As I continued ahead, the closer I got to this object, I realized as I was almost on top of it that it was a baby car seat with the front covered in a blanket. I hit my brakes and my car screamed in protest even louder. I sat in my seat staring at this baby seat, clenching my steering wheel. No way I was getting out when it was probably just a broken and dumped booster seat. I was about to pull off when I heard a noise. I turned my music down, but the sound of my shitty car engine made it hard to locate or recognize the noise. I wound my window down an inch and listened. It was a fucking baby crying. No, crying is an understatement. This poor thing was screaming. I threw my seatbelt off and unlocked my door, grabbing the handle. Then I froze. Out of the corner of my eye in the bush I thought I saw something move. It was just out of reach of the light from my headlights. I took my hand off the door slowly and sat back into my seat thinking. I remember my mum telling me to never stop my car at night, that if I see something that requires help then to move on and call for professional help, because there's nothing that requires the help of a moody short little blonde girl who can barely carry her school bag. A baby needs my help, a tiny defenseless baby. What if that was a wild animal I saw in the trees coming to have a meal out of this little thing? I thought before I opened my car door. As I did, my car let out a screech, causing whatever it was in the trees to jump. I slammed my door closed, jumping back in, and sped up the road. I got a few hairpins back up the gorge before pulling out my phone. Still no signal as I'm driving in a literal hole. I raced up to the top and back into busy streets, then called for police. I told them what I saw and they told me to go home immediately, not to stop whatsoever, keep my doors locked, and they would call me tomorrow but not to worry. The next morning Hornsby police called me thanking me for my report. They said a group of men have been placing baby seats in the middle of empty roads, covering them with a blanket which hides a speaker playing the sounds of children in distress to try and lure young women out of their cars. They then drag these women away and take advantage of them and beat them, then driving away in the women's car, leaving their victim to die in the bushes. They checked out the gorge, but the people had left. They left in such a rush they forgot the blue baby blanket with little grey elephants on it that I had described to the police as the one covering the baby seat. They said I was clever to keep going and to never get out of my car late at night, no matter what tries to stops me. Edit, my partner and I might go for a drive along this road some night this week so I can take some photos of the place so you can get a visual idea of how creepy it is. I'll make sure the doors are locked. Story 2, an old friend has been dating someone for 5 years. Today I found out they don't exist. Let me just clarify what this is not. This is not the story of my friend lying to me for 5 years. This is not your run-of-the-mill case of catfishing, which I had suspected at first. This is something much bigger, and after today I'm genuinely scared for his life, as well as mine. This friend, let's call him Noah, was never great with girls. He's kind of a nice guy, super awkward, and the only reason we were close for so long is because I came out to him as a lesbian sometime in 9th grade. Otherwise, there's no doubt he would have tried to pursue me romantically. He was pretty desperate for love, up until when we were in our early 20s, 5-ish years ago, before he met her. I feel like it means nothing to say he was big into gaming, because who isn't nowadays? Specifically, he was into these Facebook fantasy games. I don't even know what they are exactly. I think they're like shit quality RPGs that people play for free if they can't afford to subscribe to World of Warcraft. I used to get game requests from him every day. Luckily you can just block those, so I did. Anyway, this one game he used to play had a chat function which a lot of people use to meet people. It's really not that weird. I have other friends that have met hookups in a similar fashion. I was actually pretty happy for him when he told me about this girl. I'll call her Clara. At least he had someone to talk to, even though the girl was from Ohio, which is about a 7-hour drive from us. The red flags started popping up pretty early, though. Out of curiosity, I looked at Clara's Facebook profile and it was immediately suspicious to me. It's not like she seemed out of his league or anything. It looked like the kind of girl he would date. Choppy purple pixie cut, face piercings, a collarbone tattoo of a pokeball, a light dusting of acne on her pale skin. Anime convention type of girl. Definitely his type. What got me was, she uploaded a number of pictures with her in it, but there were no tags for any of the other people in the photos. They had also been uploaded all at the same time. Most of the friends she had, and the only likes/comments on her pictures and posts were, well, guys that seemed to have an intimate relationship with her. A lot of comments like "there's my beautiful girl," a lot of flirting with that dumbass 3-face. Nothing to do with the occasion, or the other people in the picture. They were all about her. Maybe I shouldn't have said anything. Did I make him dig his heels in further? I was just looking out for him and his heart, I guess. I pointed this out to Noah, but he was having none of it. He showed me that all of the comments dated back to before they started talking, and there was no overlap, either. He said there was no way this girl would cheat on him, or anyone, that she was really sweet, just flirty, and truly loved him. I mentioned the other stuff that was weird, but he snapped back that I was just looking for things to not like about her and being overprotective. He was pretty upset. My next thought was that maybe this was a profile for cheating. Like, she was with someone but she made this in order to lure men into getting with her on the side. Seems like something people do. I told my then girlfriend/current wife about it and she suggested reverse image searching a few of her photos to see if they showed up anywhere else. Besides Clara's profile, all the photos traced back to social media accounts of someone named Erica from Ft. Lauderdale. But when I went to click on the links it came up as this page does not exist, like she had deleted everything. Even though Noah was mad at me for trying to talk some sense into him, I gave it one last shot. I texted him about what I had found, hoping that this would convince him that something was up. He didn't say anything for a day or so. Then, he sent me a novel to explain why it wasn't weird at all and how over the line I was. Apparently, Clara had a very abusive ex-boyfriend who was stalking her, so she had to legally change her name, move away, and basically delete her old profiles off the internet. Fearing that he might be able to find her somehow through mutual friends, she decided not to add anyone on her new Facebook that she actually knew in real life. She was obsessed with those stupid games, too. And she wanted to meet people, especially romantic prospects, since she was pretty lonely. The pictures were to show her online friends what she looked like, and to prove that she hung out with other people at some point and wasn't just a hermit with no life or social skills. He told me that he didn't appreciate me prying into their relationship, and that he had told Clara about what I said and she didn't want me to talk to him anymore, and he had agreed to it. The last thing he said to me was, just in case you're still hung up on this, here's a picture of us FaceTiming. Sure enough, the screenshot showed him video chatting with the girl from the profile. Same hair, same face piercings, same tattoo. She looked normal, just kind of tired. Before I could say anything or apologize, he blocked me. And that was it for a while. I wasn't impressed with how defensive and shitty he had been, and although I figured she was probably using him in some way, I just let it be. He blocked me in every way he possibly could, anyway, pretty much every form of communication. So did Clara, so I couldn't see her Facebook page anymore. I had my own things going on, so I just moved past it. I moved away, got a job, got married, and all was well. We grew up in a small town, so one day when I went back to visit a few months ago, I ran into his mother at the one grocery store we have. We chatted for a while about how things were going with me, and she seemed very friendly and happy. Then, I asked her about Noah. Her entire expression changed. She looked so sad. She told me that the same year we had our falling out, Noah decided on a whim to quit his job and go live with Clara somewhere in Ohio, about 7 hours away, and he never came back. He was upset that his mom had been so disapproving of this, so he also blocked her in any way possible, and only communicated with an occasional brief email from time to time to tell her how he was doing. She blamed herself for being too overbearing. He wouldn't even tell her their address because he was afraid she would try to come find them. I felt really bad for her. I almost ran away from home in high school, because my parents didn't approve of me being gay. But once they realized I was serious about leaving, they said they could work past it as long as it meant I was home. I knew this wasn't exactly the same thing, but it was clear she was pretty hurt. I asked her for his email, thinking maybe I could try to reach out to him. Before I fell asleep, I typed up and sent an email telling him I was sorry for being so presumptuous, that I hoped he and Clara were happy, and that he should consider visiting home sometime. The next day, to my surprise, I got an email back from him. This is what it said. Dear Lil Chulty, thanks for reaching out to me after all this time. Clara and I are doing very well. I would come back to Virginia, but I just have too much going on here. You know how it is. But do tell my mom that I'm thinking about her. I hope that life is treating you well. Best. Noah. I felt a little bit of closure, I guess. At least he was happy. It seemed strange that he had nothing else to say, although perhaps Clara still harbored some bitterness towards me, and he didn't want to test that. That was an acceptable conclusion for me. Until today. My wife travels a lot. Usually she winds up in Texas, but this week she had to fly out to a small city about an hour away from Columbus, Ohio. She's mostly been sending me I miss you texts and pictures of her doing touristy things, but today she sent me something that made my blood run cold. It was a mugshot of a woman, severely abused and emaciated, with most of her teeth and half of her hair gone. My wife told me it had appeared on the local news on TV, and she immediately recognized some of the facial features, as well as the pokeball tattoo on her collarbone. It's Clara. After panicking for a straight minute, I read the full story. Apparently they found her walking through the streets early this morning, looking like she had just been beaten badly. She was in shock and mumbling random things and sobbing. The police took her in immediately, but they couldn't get any useful information from her. She seemed to have suffered from extreme trauma, or had taken illicit drugs. Either way, she couldn't form coherent sentences. Identifying her had also been futile. Her fingers had been severely burned, so they can't trace her fingerprints. I immediately contacted the police with everything I knew, and they said they're going to be launching a full-scale investigation. It will have to be as discreet as possible, though, for fear that the perpetrators will go to extreme measures to cover up their crimes or even flee from the area. They even took down all the media coverage right after I called. They've offered to fly me and Noah's mother out there so they can talk to us in person, since we're the only people who seem to know much about it. I realize there's no going back, and I have to go, but I am absolutely horrified of whatever is behind this. I got a call about an hour ago, from the police station. They told me that Clara was still in pretty bad shape and she still couldn't answer their questions. But they did say that she kept repeating the same thing, over and over and over: "My name is Erica." Story 3, I am Death's assistant. Okay, assistant may be too much. Let's say I'm more of an unpaid intern, nowhere near the top of the hierarchy. I've actually only met the man himself once. Apparently he's pretty introverted. I don't blame him. If your main job was to end thousands of people's lives a day, you'd be kinda grumpy too. You see, regardless of what people might say, being Death is a lot of work. Way too much work for one eternal demon. So in order to lighten the load, he hires assistants, or unpaid interns, such as myself. There are thousands, hell, maybe even millions of us. I'm doing my job right now. Sitting in a restaurant, with my notepad. I'm wearing a pretty inconspicuous outfit, as to not draw attention to myself. A Hawaiian shirt, blue jeans, and aviator sunglasses. Kinda stylish if you ask me. My eyes dart around the crowded Burger King, eyeing every soul inside. Pretty easy place to find people for my job. The more people, the better. Oh, my job. Almost forgot. As I mentioned, Death is a busy eternal being. My job is to notice what people are doing, all around. Wherever I am, I watch. If these people are doing something that could result in death somehow, for example, riding a Segway, God, those are dangerous machines, I write it in my somewhat magical notebook. The higher-ups then take a look at my entry immediately after I write it. Please don't ask me how the science works out. I myself have no clue. If they deem the action death-worthy, then they send someone to, see the death through. It all happens pretty instantly. I click my pen as I spot one. Number 1. Man walking on slippery tile. The middle-aged, balding man was ignorant of the caution, wet floor sign, as he made his way to the bathroom. I braced myself for what could happen next. This part always makes me nervous. I don't like watching these people die, it really pains me. But it is my job. In the last moments, he notices the sign and navigates around it, safely heading towards the bathroom. Phew. I hurriedly go back to looking around. Scanning the crowded Burger King. Aha, another one. I clicked my pen. Number 2, worker dealing with scalding hot fryer oil. I wait, and watch the kitchen, expecting the poor soul working the fryer to spontaneously combust, or get doused in the boiling oil, or potentially fall in and suffer the same fate as the fries. However, lucky for all of us, she takes the basket of fries out, shakes off the excess oil, and moves away from the fryer and in turn the risk. Another sigh of relief. I guess there's a lot of reasons I don't like watching people die. It reminds me a lot of what happened to me. I click my pen again. This one was outside. Number 3, potential jaywalker. I watched out of the big Burger King front window, as this man attempted to cross the street, against the light. Not uncommon in my city, although it's always potentially dangerous. I waited for the imminent screeching of brakes, and the painful thud of a collision. Lucky again. He makes a quick dash across the street, and continues his stroll through the city. I guess I got pretty lucky to get this job. Most don't get the opportunity, but after the crash, that's when he came to me. It wasn't his fault. The big 18-wheeler's brakes stopped working. Poor soul couldn't stop the truck as it barreled down the road. He had to choose between hitting into a school bus, or my Prius. I was in the hospital, in and out of consciousness for 2 weeks. Really close to dying at some points, others I was dreaming, or hallucinating. But one period, I remember clearly. I might have been awake, but I was probably out cold. Then I saw him. He was standing in the corner of the small hospital room. But instead of taking me, he made a bargain. He never really spoke, but somehow I knew what he was saying. Telepathy? Maybe. I might have mistook the ordeal with him for another hallucination, but something about it felt real. The accident should have been fatal. Every doctor in the hospital told me that. Death didn't take me that day, he allowed me to go back to my family, but I was in his debt for the rest of my life. When I woke up, finally, there was a notebook and a pen beside my bed. And here I am now, in a Burger King with a magical notebook. My eyes once again go person to person, watching everything, seeing if anyone is taking a potentially fatal risks. Then I spot him. I click my pen. Number 4, morbidly obese man devouring a double whopper. My eyes are drawn to this man, in a blue-collared shirt and a sports jacket, the buttons from the shirt ready to pop off under the slightest more stress. He has to be at least 400 pounds, yet here he is, devouring a double whopper. He finishes his food pretty quickly, taking a long sip of his soda. After the soda, he begins licking his fingers. A look of accomplishment streams across his face. He stands up, ready to leave, but is halted by some other force. For a few moments, he stands in his spot, his look of accomplishment changes to something else. A hand darts to his chest, as a look of pain flashes across his face. His legs begin to quiver. He makes a deep gurgling sound, before falling over, all across the table. The commotion draws the attention of most people in the Burger King, staff included. They run over with the defibrillator. A boisterous crowd has now gathered around the man. I don't like staying around much long after it happens, as I mentioned I don't like seeing these people die. So I myself stand up, and walk towards the door, pocketing my pen and notebook. The sirens wail through the air as I casually walk further and further away from the Burger King. Call it a blessing or a curse, but it is my job. Death's unpaid intern. Story 4, Skinwalkers need friends too. Northern Canada would get so cold in the winter that it was almost impossible for cars to function. So, my family became very skilled hunters. We would have a hearty meal of deer or rabbit every night, and we learned to grow vegetables indoors for a little bit of freshness in our Viking-like diet. I was around 15 when I first started to hunt alone, and I was 18 when this happened. It was early in the morning and I was tracking rabbits. I had found a nice spot near a rabbit den and bundled up, gun raised, ready to shoot. Something felt off though. It took a minute before I realized, the forest was dead quiet. No chickadees, no coyotes howling, no wind. Nothing. It was as if all the creatures in the wild disappeared. As weird as it was, I paid no mind to it and chalked it up to being too cold for animals to be out and about, though that didn't explain the lack of wind and no leaves rustling. I lay in the snow for another 16 minutes before giving up and deciding to set off a different location. Just as I slung my gun over my shoulder, I glanced to the side and froze. A large black dog stood around 10 feet away from me. The dog had on a collar, so I assume it was tamed. But the nearest house was an hour away and it made no sense that a dog would be out here. "Are you lost, boy?" I asked casually, not at the time taking into account how wrong it was for a dog to be all the way out here. "Is your owner here?" The dog just stared. Its eyes were milky and I felt as if they were boring into my skull. I approached the dog and held my hand out for it to sniff it. The dog didn't move, it didn't flinch and its tail didn't wag. I drew my hand back and rummaged through my coat pocket. I pulled out a piece of deer jerky my father had steamed during the week. I snapped it in half and offered the piece to the dog. It took the piece in its teeth before swallowing it whole. I laughed nervously as the dog licked its chaps. "Hungry, huh? What are you doing out here?" I knelt down and stroked the dog's head. Its coat was freezing, like the dog had frostbite or fell in a river, but somehow wasn't wet. Its milky white eyes stared into me still. At the time I assumed it was cataracts. A bark came from the left of me, and both me and the dog turned to look. An entire pack of dogs stood in the clearing, all with milky white eyes and black fur. Chills ran down my spine, but still, being a stupid teenager, I just thought it was just a trait of that breed. The dog looked back at me and licked my hand with a tongue that felt like ice before running over to the group. I watched as the pack moved on. The largest dog's eyes lingered on me, before following the others. I watched as they ran off out of the clearing. It was like a reset mode as soon as they left because the forest came back to life. I could hear chickadees, the rustle of wind through leaves and the scattering of nearby rabbits and shrews. I shot 3 rabbits and headed home, still curious about the dogs. A week later I asked why Dad about it, but he said that the neighbor's dog, Sombra, had been missing for months and everyone else either didn't have a dog that matched my description, or just didn't have a dog in general. I thought that was very unnerving and didn't hunt for a while after that. The next time I saw the dog it was early spring. I didn't have school to attend until the fall, so I just helped out at home and read and raised chickens. One Monday, both my parents were in Calgary visiting friends, and my brother was sick downstairs watching Game of Thrones, so I was pretty much alone. I sat in the library, reading and sipping some sweet Earl Grey tea. The rain was in a full-out downpour, so the chores I could carry out were mainly indoors and quick to complete. Scratching came at the door, causing the hair on my neck to stand up. We didn't own any animals that could scratch. Scared and curious, I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and opened the door. The black dog stood there, its familiar milky eyes staring into my soul. I jumped in surprise at first, but quickly smiled at the thought that the dog came all the way from the woods to my house. "Hey bud," I said, bending down and petting its frosty skin. "How did you find me?" "It was the lavender, wasn't it?" I joked, referring to the essential oil I always had on my hunting gloves and wrists. I could have been mistaken, but I swore the dog nodded its head slightly. "Where are your friends?" I asked. "My brother loves dogs, we could all play a game of ultimate frisbee." The dog blinked up at me in an almost amused manner. It nudged my arm with its cold nose. "Do you want jerky, bud?" I asked. The dog blinked. "All right then. Wait here." I walked to the pantry and grabbed her bag of jerky before returning to the dog. I once again snapped a piece of jerky in half and gave the half to the dog. It swallowed it whole like it did the first time and just sort of wandered back into the tree line. I laughed to myself and the rest of the day went by normally. I awoke that night with fear in my chest. It felt as if I was being watched. Slowly, I sat up and peeked through the curtains. My breath hitched. A woman stared back at me. She stood in the tree line completely naked. She looked Native American but with milky white skin that almost glowed in the moonlight. Her black hair was in two long braids. I felt my world crash around me as I stared into her big, white milky eyes. Just like the dog's, I realized. The woman caught my gaze through the window and smiled. It sent chills into my heart. She walked to the window, almost as if approaching an old friend, and tapped onto the glass. I don't know why I did, but I opened the window out of pure curiosity. "Are you okay, lady?" I asked, trying not to sound fearful. She just nodded and said something in a language that I couldn't pin down. I caught nighttime and forest, so it may have been Cree, but it sounded so ancient. "Do you want me to call the police?" She cocked her head to the side. I take it she couldn't understand the question. She took me by surprise when she took hold of my wrist and put a feather into my hand. Her hands were so cold that I shivered. Then she just turned and ran back into the woods. I awoke the next morning convinced that it was a dream, but I turned to find the feather on my dresser. I haven't seen the dog for a year now and I have no idea why the woman came to my window. I still have the feather and I still wear lavender oil. I don't know why the woman and the dog had the same eyes, but after doing some research, I learned about skinwalkers and I feel that that is what I encountered. But they weren't malevolent in any way, and I never felt threatened, only a bit uneasy and cold. And I don't know if this is related in any way, but I often find little presents on my windowsill like rabbit skin, and my parents are curious why dead owls keep appearing on the porch. Story 5, My kids aren't right anymore. My son is 17 and my daughter is 15. My son can drive, so he drives himself to and from school while my daughter rides the bus. She wanted to ride the bus because she has a lot of friends on there. My son is named Drake and my daughter is named Shelby. They are really close and tell each other everything. Shelby is a small girl with long blonde hair and Drake is a tall strong boy with black, short hair, like his father. Shelby had always been the social butterfly and Drake had his fair share of friends too, but never quite to the extent of his sister. But they had always looked out for each other and I was proud of that. They were good kids, got decent grades, kept mostly out of trouble, and hung out with friends a lot. Drake had only dabbled in weed, but they stayed away from drugs and alcohol otherwise. Now with the necessary information given, I can get to what has been wrong. One day my daughter came home crying and Drake asked her what was wrong. I was still at work. She told him that there were some boys at school who cornered her in the boys' bathroom and sexually assaulted her. He asked who they were and that he would take care of it. The next day he found all of the boys one by one and beat them almost to death. He had been in fights before but never hurt someone this badly. One boy was even in the hospital for a month. Drake was suspended for a week afterwards. 3 months later Shelby was suspended for 3 days after she snapped at a teacher who was getting onto her for not doing her work and bit him. Random incidents like this had started happening more and got more and more violent as the year went on. Once summer came was when things really got bad. They had started whispering to each other, ignoring me, carving words like blame them into the walls, and even snapping at me. They had never been bad kids, especially to me. This all led to one night Mama. I could hear my daughter screaming for me from her room. I ran to her and found a half-eaten girl laying in my daughter's floor. Why, Mama? Why did I do this? Why did I do this? Who am I? I couldn't answer her. All I could do was stare. And that's when it hit me. My son was nowhere to be found. I turned and ran from my own daughter and hid in the bathroom downstairs. Hours passed before I heard the front door open. Drake had walked in covered in blood. His face was horrified. He went upstairs to his sister's room and stayed in there for half an hour. I was too scared to come out of the bathroom, but I could hear them shuffling around in the living room. And then I heard the front door close. I peeked out of the bathroom to see the words "We can't help it" and "We're sorry Mama" written in blood on the carpet. I broke down and cried. What had happened to my kids? My sweet, cheerful daughter had just killed and eaten a girl upstairs. And God knows what my son had done. I called the cops and when they arrived they told me the girl upstairs had been identified as Lily Thompson, my daughter's best friend, and that 3 other bodies had been found, 2 being students from my kids' school, and 1 being a teacher. All 3 of them had had their guts spilled out and their mouths ripped wide open. This all happened 6 months ago and my kids were never found. But yesterday I got word that the principal and 4 other students were found dead, 2 girls were half-eaten, and the rest had their guts spilled and their mouths ripped wide open. It must run in the family. 16 years ago me and my husband were eagerly awaiting our second child when a burglar broke in and attempted to kill Drake. But my husband had stopped him and beat him to death. 3 months later he had started going crazy. He started hurting small animals and even me and our children. One day he came home from work covered in blood. He had murdered 3 of his co-workers and his boss. He looked at me and said, "I don't want to do this, I have to," and then charged upstairs to Drake's room where I chased him and found him picking him up and throwing him into the wall. I lunged at him and we fought for a couple seconds before he easily overpowered me. I knew what I had to do for our children. I ran to our bedroom and pulled his gun from the drawer and shot him. Now our kids are acting the same way he did. I don't know what to do anymore. But now it makes sense what he meant, but I don't want to, I have to. He knew this would happen. He told me it happened to his father and uncle, their mother, and even her father. And yet I chose to stay with him. I chose to have 2 kids with him. He knew this would happen to our kids as well. It runs in the family. Story 6, One Final Unselfish Act. One final unselfish act. The following is an official transcript recovered from the black box of downed Flight 217. After being told that a terrorist cell had placed a deadly airborne plague agent in the climate control system of the plane, the pilot and co-pilot agonized over what to do. After they elected to reveal the horrible truth to the passengers, the captain waxed philosophic for some time over the speaker system. His calming words of wisdom offer a glimpse into the state of mind of the dedicated crew and passengers of the doomed flight. Far beyond that, it reveals genuine proof of one last unselfish act by everyone involved in the horrible tragedy. Pilot and crew remarks are in quotations. Internal FAA notations or clarifications made regarding specific circumstances are listed in parentheses. The pilot Paul Reardon addressing the entire plane over the PA system. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Flight 217 with non-stop service from Boston to Atlanta. We ask that you pay attention to the safety demonstration by the flight attendants and keep your seats buckled at all times. Exceptions being for using the lavatory or when we have the seatbelt sign turned off. We are currently cruising at an altitude of 37,000 feet and our air travel time today is expected to be 3 hours and 35 minutes. At the moment it is partially cloudy and 86 degrees Fahrenheit in Atlanta. As always, we thank you for flying with us. Over the course of the next 37 minutes, the pilot and co-pilot, Matt Dobbs, discuss the routine flight operations among themselves. Those basic details about airspeed, elevation, fuel consumption and other aviation-related things have been omitted here because they bear no relevance to the official FAA investigation. Around 38 minutes into the flight, Captain Reardon received an urgent call over the radio. The details of which lead to the premature demise of all 147 souls aboard. Flight 217, this is air traffic control. I have a priority 1 message for the captain's ears only. Do you read me? The captain responded that he was listening privately after the co-pilot removed his headset in full compliance with the controller's privacy request. Please hold for Earl Greenberg of the CDC. This is David Earl Greenberg. Am I speaking with Paul H. Reardon, the captain of Flight 217 from Boston to Atlanta? The pilot answered in affirmative. There's no easy way to say this, Captain. I'm sorry to have to report to you that the FBI and Department of Homeland Security are here with me. They've officially verified that an embedded terrorist sleeper cell has infiltrated security sections inside Logan International Airport. Under intense interrogation, the suspects admitted releasing an extremely virulent, very weaponized strain of neurotoxin into the climate system of your airplane. Incubation is less than 8 hours and there is no treatment for this airborne virus. I repeat, we have no vaccine or cure. The pilot can be heard uttering "Oh my God" over his headset at the declaration. This biological weapon is highly contagious and 100% fatal. Every man, woman and child on that plane will be dead within 36 hours. That is a fact. I'm deeply sorry. Captain Reardon interrupts. Is this some kind of sick joke? There must be a mistake here. I feel fine. Then he addresses the co-pilot. You feel okay, don't you, Matt? As soon as we land, we can have the CDC or NSA test the air in the plane for whatever it is you think. The caller cuts him off. You can't land that plane. There is no antidote or vaccine. It's incredibly contagious and absolutely fatal. I know you served in the Air Force, Captain. I'm calling on your years of training and distinguished service to do the right thing for all involved. No one on that plane must survive. There will be a terrible epidemic if anyone does. Millions will die. Atlanta was the chosen target because our offices would be overrun and incapacitated. This weaponized strain infects every person who comes in contact with it. Then they were planning to release the same neurotoxin-laced virus in every other major U.S. city to set off a biological pandemic. To save millions of American lives, I implore you. You must crash the plane and sacrifice everyone aboard including yourself. There can be no survivors. There was dead air for nearly 30 seconds as Captain Reardon took in the devastating news. Matt Dobbs expressed grave concern at the somber tone of the one-sided conversation. He demanded to know what was going on. The captain appeared to be hesitant to reveal what he'd just been told. It was a horrific thing to learn. Eventually Reardon did inform Dobbs of what was said. Both men were in shock. Captain, can I depend on you to do the right thing here for the sake of the country? When there wasn't an immediate agreement from him, the conversation took on a darker direction. Reardon, listen. The President of the United States has authorized the Air Force to shoot you down if necessary in the interest of public safety. We are all hoping to avoid that. There would probably be eyewitnesses and an official inquiry. If you steer your plane into Lake Allatoona, just north of the Atlanta airport, it can be written off by the FAA as a tragic accident. We don't need to create a huge panic about these individuals having a deadly biological weapon on American soil. We must contain the situation. If you crash the plane, millions of others will avoid this agonizing death. You can also spare everyone aboard the horrible fever by crashing the plane while everyone is still asymptomatic. It's a matter of weighing the lives of those on the plane versus hundreds of thousands, or possibly millions. The captain again expressed disbelief and asked for an official confirmation from another source. He demanded to hear it from the lips of an individual authorized to speak on matters of national security. The microphone was handed over to authenticate the agonizing scenario. This is Richard A. Farnsworth, Director of Homeland Security. I'm sorry, Captain, but the news is true. My colleague here from the CDC can advise you of the technical details, but based on what I've seen, this thing you've been infected with is a nightmare. It makes Ebola look like a case of the sniffles. Whether you crash the plane or land somewhere, you and everyone else aboard will be dead in less than 2 days. The difference is that, if you all die in the crash, no one on the ground will be infected and die. The president has already scrambled fighter jets to shoot you down. They are en route as we speak. He doesn't want to risk you or the co-pilot trying to be heroes, but I've asked him for the favor. He agreed to allow you a few minutes to accept this horrible fate and die in the unselfish service of others. Over the next few minutes, both men went through the universal stages of doubt, anger, grief, bargaining, and then finally acceptance. Just 5 minutes earlier, both men had been completely dedicated to full safety of all passengers and crew arriving at their destination. Now they were being asked to deliberately murder almost 150 innocent lives. It was beyond surreal. This is not a drill, Captain. The suspects have confessed. The runway tube has tested positive for particulate residue of the deadly virus. The ground crew who emptied the lavatory tanks for your plane this morning are already dying in CDC isolation. Make peace with your maker and do what needs to be done for the greater good. Reardon and Dobbs had a marathon ethics discussion over what to do. Both men went through waves of anger and prolonged sadness. The air traffic controller instructed them to alter their flight path slightly to take the plane over the massive North Georgia lake. Despite their shock and bitter misgivings, they did as they were directed. They were also advised to not tell any of the crew or passengers, but that didn't sit as well with Captain Reardon. He told the co-pilot that the people deserved to know what was coming, even if it brought them deep fear and misery. It would also allow them to make peace with what was happening and understand that their deaths served a purpose. More importantly, their sacrifices, as tragic as they were, would save others. First, he had the depressing but necessary duty of informing and preparing the crew. Attention. I need all available crew members to report to the cockpit for an important Tulsa briefing. His wording was airline speak for an emergency situation that the crew recognized. Once they entered the pilot's area, they could be heard expressing apprehension and fear over the panic code. They knew enough to worry, but they weren't prepared for what the pilot was about to tell them. Honestly, how could anyone be? They were all consummate airline professionals, and while aircraft crashes are always a possibility, this was a very different story. The plane itself had no operational issues. The pilots were lucid and highly capable, and yet they were told they were all going to die in just a few minutes. The crew went through the same 5 stages of grief and anger. The natural human impulse was to deny what they were told or fight against it. They all desperately wanted to live, but the somber facts and necessary path was clear. Once they'd composed themselves, they returned back to the cabin to complete their very courageous flight. At this point, the pilot made the toughest announcement of his life. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Paul Reardon. Your co-pilot is Matt Dobbs. I want to thank each and every one of you for making this journey with us. What I'm about to tell you is incredibly painful and difficult to express, but I feel you all deserve to know the truth. I say that because, as terrible as it is, I would want to know if I was seated out there across the aisle from you. About 45 minutes ago I was informed by the CDC and Department of Homeland Security that our plane had been sabotaged by terrorists. Some form of deadly neurotoxin virus was placed in the air conditioning system of this plane. I've been on the radio with the CDC and Homeland Security. What we've been exposed to is both highly contagious and incurable. I've been given the option of deliberately crashing this plane, or we will be shot down to prevent causing an epidemic on the ground that will potentially kill millions. I am so sorry, ladies and gentlemen. I know that no one here was prepared to die, but we must accept this fate to save others. I've been assured that our deaths will save millions. I'd rather face death with each of you than be shot out of the sky. I wish there was any other choice. I wanted to give every single person here a few minutes to pray or just meditate. Please forgive me for what I'm about to do. Prepare to die. Cell phone video recovered from the wreckage recorded the reaction to the captain's gut-wrenching speech. Understandably, there was fear, panic, chaos, and denial for the next few moments. The people wept and cried, but unlike an unexpected crash, they had a brief period to overcome their lamentations. As if on cue, 2 F-17s arrived and were visible outside the windows. The moment arrived as the plane rapidly approached the proposed destination for the planned crash. The insinuation was clear to Dobbs and Reardon. If they didn't take the plane down, it would be immediately shot down. Faced with that choice, the pilot did what was requested. The last transmission was by Mr. Dobbs. He announced that they were going down. Simultaneously, the crew and passengers recited the Lord's Prayer or other sacred mantras. According to recovered black box data, the crash occurred at 11:43 EST. All lives were lost. The FAA, FBI, Department of Homeland Security, and other federal agencies worked to investigate the circumstances of the crash. At the time, no one knew why Captain Reardon and his co-pilot deliberately diverted and crashed their jet. Only later did the startling details of the diabolical plot to deceive the pilots come to light. A real terrorist network installed sophisticated jamming equipment into the plane's communication system. The purpose was to make it appear as if the pilot was talking to actual air traffic controllers and government agents. The plan all along was to deceive the innocent crew members into downing the plane and taking their lives. After capitalizing on a few of these sophisticated attacks, they planned to claim responsibility for them and strike terror into the heart of the country. Once the pilot diverted the flight plan and failed to explain his actions to real air traffic controllers monitoring their flight progress, it triggered civil defense fighter jets. They were scrambled to escort the unresponsive, suspicious-acting commercial airline back to its regular trajectory. It was an ingenious and successful plan to hack the air traffic communications grid, but the courageous victims had no way of knowing it was a sadistic hoax. In the end, they gave their lives for a noble cause they believed in. Their reluctant martyrdom was a final unselfish act. Story 7, Uber doesn't pay you when your passenger dies. Daniel's pickup point was at the northeast corner of 37th and 2nd. Anything that close to the Midtown Tunnel during morning rush hour was a pain in the ass, but luck seemed to be on my side when a fellow black Camry braved the angry honks of surrounding traffic to let me into the left lane. I used to think an easy pickup was a good sign. It was barely 8:30 in the morning, but already the temperature had climbed to the low 90s and the poor guy was wearing a suit, jacket and all. I cranked the AC as he got into the back seat going downtown. Daniel's route popped up in the app as I started the ride. "Yeah," he answered, "Church and VC." Just as I was about to take the 36th Street entrance to the FDR, the app dinged with another pickup, Evan. All the way on 23rd and Park Avenue South. Skipping the highway and going crosstown bumped back Daniel's drop-off time by 20 minutes. I heard him sigh behind me. Evan was small, blonde and female. Maybe it was her boyfriend's account or her parents had really wanted a boy. She shivered obviously and I took the hint, turning the AC down a bit. Evan was going to Brooklyn, I'd be dropping off Daniel first. I checked a quick glance at him in the rear view mirror, his chin was against his chest and I'd assumed he'd fallen asleep. We were being routed down Broadway now, at this hour it would be traffic the whole way. He had some time to get in a quick nap. Daniel slept while Evan fucked around with her phone. The app directed me to his drop-off point and we reached the corner of Broadway and VC at 9:20. Looks like he'd have to walk. This good? I asked when he didn't move to get out. Actually, it looked like he was still asleep. Hey man, I said a little louder, time to get out. You're here. This got Evan's attention, but not Daniel's. She rolled her eyes at me in the mirror. Come on, she shook him lightly. The look on her face grew concerned when he still didn't fucking move, except to slump against the door. You think he's okay? I turned the hazards on and got out. I'm not sure what I expected to happen when I opened the back door, but when Daniel tumbled out onto the concrete, his face impassive and peaceful, I was somehow both surprised and not surprised at the same time. He wasn't breathing. Apparently he hadn't been for a while. I didn't stick around to find out what had happened, just long enough for me and Evan to give the cops and paramedics a statement and our contact information in case there was anything else they needed. I'd ended Evan's ride to Brooklyn long ago and offered to take her wherever she wanted, which ended up being back to Flatiron. She was shaken. I was too, but I'm pretty sure I would have remembered to tip. I wish I could say that Daniel was the only passenger who died in my car. Truth is, he was only the first. Story 8, Man's Most Loyal Companion. It can't happen to me. There's so many people out there that it can't possibly happen to me. The truth is anyone can win the lottery, and anyone could be in the wrong place at the wrong time. I still remember the night my life became a living hell. I had turned on the TV to check the weather before making my plans for the weekend. This was before smartphones were commonplace, and on the news the anchorman was relaying a warning from the local police station. I hadn't paid much attention to it, because it couldn't possibly affect me. All I cared about was the weather, and the clear skies meant I would be spending my time outside in a few days. That night I locked my doors and went to sleep. I woke up to the barking of my dog Baxter. Both scared of any hidden dangers and angry neighbors, I quickly went to go check what had him so riled up, a fallen tree branch. I shut the blinds and after a few minutes he eventually calmed down, and I began to make my way upstairs when I heard glass breaking behind me. Baxter had jumped through the fucking window. I quickly exited through the door to see him chasing a man I recognized but I couldn't quite remember who. I quickly shouted a number of commands at Baxter while continually chasing him. Eventually he listened and sat down. I examined the dog and was surprised he had gotten as far as he had. Several glass shards pierced his paws and many more were jammed into his head and rib cage. The only local vet's office was closed, so I rushed him to the hospital but I could tell he was dead before I was even halfway to the hospital. I don't know why I continued to drive. I guess it was my confusion. I didn't know what to do so I just kept going forward. I didn't take him in, I just turned the car around and headed home. When I got back, I saw several squad cars and an EMS truck surrounding my neighbor's home. I asked one of the officers what happened, fearing for one of my best friend's life. He told me Jacob Wilstrow had killed my neighbor, but not before she had managed to bite his legs, which eventually caused him to lose his mobility. I knew the name Jacob Wilstrow, but I didn't put a face to his name, until I remembered the man my dog had jumped through a window to get to, the same man the police station used the news to warn us about. I told the policemen about the incident, and looked around the yard, the tree, and down the street. It turns out he had been hiding in my tree, when one branch couldn't support his weight and snapped, causing him to fall down. It's safe to say that the next few days were not easy for me. First losing my dog, then my neighbor and best friend caused me to take my first drink in 3 years, because I didn't care about his relapse. Why would I? That one drink quickly turned into bar fight, and eventually I was taken to the police station. The officers recognized me, and took the opportunity to ask me if my neighbor had any dogs. I told them that she did not. They wouldn't tell me what happened exactly, but it didn't take a genius to figure out what happened. That son of a bitch was bit by a dog while trying to escape. I guess my dog had died but did not leave my side, and sometimes, when I'm feeling especially lonely, I can feel something lying down at the edge of my bed. Story 9, the body. Fibromyalgia. That's what the doctor had said years ago. Ever since I was young, I struggled with pain. I was called a wimp in school and even my parents were a little disappointed by me. "Man up," my dad would say, noting how I would seemingly always complain about pain. When I was a kid, I would just have odd pains. They would come out of seemingly nowhere. I would look at a kid that was bullying me and a few moments later, I'd be in pain without him even touching him. When I thought about jumping off the swing set like the other kids, I would end up feeling pain in my legs. I did not really understand it when I was younger, and I would not until I was much older. As the years went on, I would still feel what I thought was random pain. I had gone to the doctor and he said that I was dealing with fibromyalgia, which is a bit embarrassing. It basically reinforces everything I'd been told throughout my life, except now I felt like there was nothing I could do about it. I always thought I could grow out of being a wimp or grow into being a man. But apparently, if I wanted to do that, I would have to be on one of those TV medications. You know the ones, the medications with the commercials where mellow music plays, accompanied by a soft, feminine voice talking about pain and then the myriad of side effects. Yet, I went ahead with it. I figured that if anything could help, I would try it. But it did not help in the slightest. To the untrained observer, it would appear to help because I was not always in pain. However, I still felt pain, a lot of it. For example, one of the jobs I had required me to cross about 4 lanes of traffic on a busy street. There was no stoplight or stop sign for the other drivers, so I was forced to cut across. However, every time I did, I felt an immense pain crash through my body. It was intense and shook me to the core. I recall having to sit in my car for a few minutes before work every day while I waited for the pain to subside. This happened every single day I took that commute. It was the fastest way there, and any other route would take me an extra 5 minutes to get there. I guess, at the time, I weighed my options and decided to deal with the pain if it meant shaving off a minute or two. I guess I should have known something was off when the pains started becoming less and less frequent. There was nothing that triggered the slowing down, but I was grateful for it at the time. Put yourself in my shoes. If your entire life was pain, then when that pain started to subside, you would be grateful, no matter the cause nor who it hurt in the process. Still, people noticed my enhanced demeanor. I was no longer sulking around, waiting for the next pain to strike. Instead, I was cheerful and ready to tackle each day. Sure, I still felt the pains every now and then, but they had become few and far between. That's not to say they did not hurt like hell, though. I would feel like someone gored me with a sharp object on some days, and other days, I would feel a sharp pain across my throat, among other such pains. Still, I managed to get through it. Then they stopped entirely. I can recall the very day they stopped, too. I was walking to the mailbox when I felt a sharp pain strike through my chest, as if I had just been shot. I clutched my chest and groaned as I fell to my knees, but as soon as it started, it stopped. I shrugged it off and went to get the mail. After that day, the pain stopped. Sure, I still felt normal pain from cuts and bruises that I would get, but not those intense, random pains. I should have been elated, I should have felt like a huge weight had been lifted off my shoulders, but it was the opposite. I felt a dark sense of foreboding. With each passing day, I felt myself longing for the pain again. But each day, it did not return. Instead, I felt dread and paranoia, as if something bad was going to happen, but I was not sure what it would be. I wanted to chalk it up to anxiety, something I dealt with every so often. Hey, who hasn't? But this was different. I could tell when I was worrying about something unrealistic. I could usually talk myself down from an anxiety attack. This was something else. I did not even know what I was fearing or where it came from. When the paranoia would set in, I did not know what I was supposed to be on the lookout for, if anything at all. That brings me to a few nights ago. I had this vivid dream where I was in my house, but it wasn't me in there. I suppose it's hard to explain. Have you ever had a dream where you were looking through your own eyes, but it was almost like it wasn't you in your body? That's what I felt like. I was merely an observer as this dream version of myself wrote something down. As I looked through those familiar, yet foreign, eyes, I could make out the writing clearly. It was indeed my handwriting, but I did not know what the message was supposed to mean. It read out, "There are 3 of us left. I don't know what's going on. I don't know how to stop it. This is the only way I can think of communicating. Be safe." I didn't wake up immediately after that, as most people seem to when they've had weird dreams or nightmares. I slept throughout the night, but when I woke up, the message had imprinted itself in my mind. I could see it clearly no matter what I was doing or thinking about. But still, I'm not sure what it means. All I know is that it did nothing to calm my paranoia. Story 10. My wife has had recurring nightmares and flashes of a night at her grandmother's when she was little. I asked her if it would be okay for me to write it in story form, and she said it was okay. The young girl, awoken from deep sleep by the terrible noise, shuffled slowly down the hall from her room. The faint light from the television's flicker was the only thing lighting her steps. The television was muted. All she could hear was that terrible sound. Clutching the bear that her grandma had gotten for her when she was born, the young girl stepped into the room where Grandma and Grandpa were sitting in their recliners. They always sat in those recliners, they loved them. The girl was only a few steps from the room now. She could see the backs of their heads over the backs of the chairs. She kept hearing that noise. In her sleepiness, she wondered if her grandparents had purchased for her a kitten and were planning to surprise her with it the following day. However, the kitten sounded very unhappy. It was hissing and spitting non-stop. As she stepped down into the room, with the silent footsteps of a child, the sound grew louder. She wondered why no sound was coming from the television. A black and white western was playing, Grandpa's favorite. The girl stepped around the left side of the first recliner so that she could see her grandparents. She would never forget what she saw. Grandpa's face seemed to sag even more than it normally did, she thought. His thick eyebrows sagged down so low that they must have obstructed his vision. She was about to speak and ask for some juice, but her voice left her when she saw. She realized the horrible noise she was hearing was coming from her grandma. Grandma was motionless in her seat. It was strange how still her body was considering how rapidly her face was moving. Grotesque twisting and moaning and hissing and spitting. She was dying. The girl simply knew it. There was no other explanation. Her grandma was dying. Why wasn't Grandpa doing something? Why wasn't he worried? The girl managed to utter a single word, ever so quietly, nearly a whisper. Grandma? As fast as you can flip a light switch and see light, Grandma turned her head. The noise stopped. She began rocking in her chair and faced the girl with a warm smile. "Oh, and why are you up so late, dear? I'm thirsty. Well, I believe I've got your favorite in the fridge. Let me go get it for you." Grandma smiled warmly and stood up from her chair. Grandpa never looked away from the flickering, muted television. The girl followed Grandma back into the kitchen. The girl was shaking. She couldn't figure out why. Grandma gave the girl a juice box, took her hand, and led her back to her room. Grandma's hand was ice cold, but completely dry. It was like the feeling of the sidewalk on a cold day. Grandma tucked her in, and gave her a kiss on the head. Now, it is very late. You must go to sleep now, dear." "Yes, Grand." The girl never finished the sentence. Over Grandma's shoulder, the girl could see into her closet. The door was opened ever so slightly and the street light in front of Grandma's house that acted as her nightlight shone directly into the crack. There, the girl also saw her grandma. The girl could see a single eye of the grandma in the closet. The eye was wide, and full of panic. Desperate panic. There was sweat all over her face. Grandma was always wet. Every time she hugged Grandma her skin was wet. The grandma in the closet raised a shaking finger slowly to her lips. She showed the sign of hush, begging the child with her eyes to stay silent. The grandma that was standing over the child continued to smile warmly. "Good night, dear." The bad grandma backed out of the room, never turning her back on the girl. She shut the door slowly, while smiling warmly. As soon as the door was shut, the terrible noise began again. The girl gripped her sheets tightly. Her eyes dashed from her closet and back to the door. She would rather die than hear this noise anymore. As soon as the bad grandma's footsteps were gone, the grandma in the closet threw open the closet doors and whispered the girl's name, moving toward her with shaking, extended hands. Sweat was dripping from her brow. Her expression was one of relief. The noise was still there. It seemed to grow louder. The girl couldn't draw a breath. She closed her eyes tightly, gripping the sheets around her tightly. She counted to 3 in her head. Then she woke up. "Good morning, dear." The girl struggled to open her eyes from tired sleep. She had to use her hands to rub her eyes and help force the sleep away from them. When she opened her eyes, she saw her grandma, smiling tenderly. Grandma came over and kissed the girl on the forehead. Then, Grandma opened the blinds and the morning sun shone brightly into the girl's bedroom. "Good morning, Grandma." The girl's voice strained. She still hadn't fully awoken from sleep. "Come dear, let us go have some breakfast. I've got your favorite." Grandma stretched her hand for the girl to take. The girl pushed her blanket off and turned and placed her feet on the cold wood floor. With her eyes barely able to open, she reached out a hand. Strange, the girl thought. Her grandma's hand was cold, and dry. Story 11, Itsy Bitsy. I'm writing this for my own sanity. I know no one will believe me. There was nothing left in the morning after anyway. But my manager, those police officers. They can all go to hell. I know what I saw, and it wasn't sleep deprivation or being overworked, or some coping mechanism. I started working at that hotel in the Poconos after I got out of college. I had loans to pay off and working night shift would allow me to work on outside projects while I watched the front desk. The property was small, only the main office and then the 10 rooms we had for rent. The parking lot was ingeniously put between the main office and the rental rooms, and worse yet the office windows did not face the hotel rooms, only the street. So any complaints I receive in the middle of the night required me to get up and cross the parking. The main office was small, only large enough for 1 or 2 people at the counter and then room for me behind the desk. 10 rooms don't require much paperwork or many keys, so the office was bare of any official paperwork save for the small file drawer under the front desk. 2 waiting room chairs were stuffed into the corner in front of the desk, but no one ever wanted to sit in them. Besides appearing like they were ripped from a Greyhound bus and awfully stained, sitting in them made you face the front desk abysmally close, with no room to move your legs. There was a single phone in the office which could make outside calls, but required a painfully long code to be input before you could dial out. There were no outlets in the front office save for a single power strip which was haphazardly filled with every plug for anything electric. Worse yet, any customer sitting in the chairs could accidentally kick the power strip, causing the lights to flicker or go out. The row of 10 hotel rooms was a long building sitting at the back of the property. The owner figured that the ancient trees towering over the backside would provide ample shade in the summer, so the string of rooms was built beneath them. I grew up in the Poconos, and never before nor ever again do I want to see trees that old. At night they could play vicious tricks on your eyes and appear to move when there was no breeze. The creaking of their branches would roar above the katydids. The whole place smelled of desperation, where people would go after they had committed horrible crimes, or would want to get away from their wives with some girl from the office. I've had 1 or 2 angry wives rocket into the parking lot, screaming at the top of their lungs. With so few tenants I had never received a noise complaint even then. The only sounds that you would hear during the night were from nature, and those staying in the Poconos know that is par for the course. But nature isn't fully understood, and if that night is any indication of its depths, then I pray we never know them. That night I had 2 guests. The first was a well-to-do businessman who insisted I only call him by his first name. He had come from New York, he told me, and was just staying for 1 night before he caught the bus in the morning. They have his full name and information on file behind the desk. I try not to think about it. Tim was nice enough, even though he looked absolutely appalled when he arrived at the office. I tried my hardest not to laugh at the man who was probably used to 5-star stays in Miami or Florida, and he had a hard enough time bringing his briefcase up to the counter that we both had a good laugh. He was friendly, so I walked him over to his room, number 8, and gave him our rules and regulations. His only request was that I not wake him in the middle of the night because he had to be up so early to make his bus. After Tim settled in, it must have been hours before I saw another person out on the street. It wasn't until maybe 1 a.m. before I saw a car drive by at breakneck speeds, no doubt some high school kid out on a joyride, his engine roaring through to your ears before you could see the car come, and well after it had gone. It was 2 a.m. when I saw the second guest. He walked in a kind of staggered pace, as if he had a broken or sprained leg. He wore a long trench coat with business attire underneath, and a large fedora that nearly blocked his entire face. From what I could glean, I was happy for the hat. The man looked to have been mangled in some horrible attack, and did his best to keep his head down when he stumbled into the office. Around his neck was a red scarf that wrinkled and twitched as he moved. I had not noticed when the man walked up from the street because of the lack of lighting outside, but he was actually quite wide, and at first I worried that he would not fit in the office. His back took up much of this width, looking to be some sort of large hump or deformity. I tried not to look at it, but with the man hiding his face it was hard not to notice. At times it seemed to move on its own or make quiet squishing noises. I took the time to gag when I bent down to retrieve his check-in paperwork. When I returned from under the desk, the man was sitting in one of the waiting chairs. I was surprised to see a person of his size fit into the chair comfortably, and it almost seemed like a part of him had been swallowed by the crease to accommodate. I caught myself staring and turned quickly, hoping he did not notice me. He did not move at all. Eager to get this strange man out of the office, I asked for his papers. He struggled to get his hands into his pockets, almost as if he was using his arm for the first time. I figured it was the medications he was probably on. The motion reminded me of a puppeteer trying to work a marionette, and I felt bad for him with whatever malady afflicted his body. Eventually he succeeded, and produced his ID and credit card. The ID read Brad Geiger of Chalfont, Pennsylvania. The picture that accompanied it showed a young man smiling, and I dared not ask for Mr. Geiger to look up to match the photo. Clearly whatever had happened to him had happened after the picture was taken, and to ask for something like that was of very poor taste. I smiled and slid the ID back to Mr. Geiger, who again fumbled to pick it up. I had lived in Chalfont for some time when I was younger, and feeling for Mr. Geiger and his woes tried to strike up a conversation. "So you're from Chalfont? I used to go to school there." Mr. Geiger's head tilted upwards ever so slightly. His right hand shot up to his scarf-covered throat quickly, and with none of the trouble he had displayed before. He spoke slowly and with tremendous difficulty. "Yes, long way from home." I grimaced and turned away to hide the face, pretending to search for his room key. It was something in the way he spoke. It reminded me of the sound made by smokers who had a hole in their throat and had to cover it with their finger when talking. Worse still, it sounded like something was plucking his vocal cords like guitar strings. I refrained from asking any more questions and passed the key to Mr. Geiger. He stood up, and in doing so accidentally bumped the power strip, causing the lights to go out. I instinctively dropped down to fix the strip, and froze before I stood. In the split second before the lights had come on, I had caught Mr. Geiger looking at me from under his hat. He had begun to drool on the counter. More than that, in the dark something about his eyes had deeply disturbed me. Before I could even rise and tell him where the room was, he turned and shambled out the door, his back bulging and shifting as he walked. I shook from disgust when I figured him far enough away, and crashed into my chair. It would be 2 more hours before I received the noise complaint. It was almost 3 a.m. when the phone rang. As I've previously stated, the phone never rings because we never sell out, and even when we do, there's never anything louder than the creaking trees. It was hard to believe that either of the 2 guests I had were partying, but when I answered the phone it was indeed Tim in room 8. Tim explained that there was a horrendous pounding and scratching on his ceiling, as if something was tapping maddeningly at the roof. I assured him that it was the trees at the back of the property, and that none of our rooms could escape their reach. If he needed it, I had earplugs in the office I could run over. Tim thanked me and hung up the phone. I grabbed the individual package of earplugs just in case. Sure enough, in less than 5 minutes Tim had called back to say that the banging and scraping had increased in speed, and if it would be too much of a bother for me to check to make sure there was no bird or raccoon on the roof above his room. I assured him that I would do just that and grabbed the high-powered flashlight from under the desk and hung up the phone. Outside the air hung thick like a cloud. No fog had rolled in, but I suspected it would soon. There was no breeze, and I started to sweat halfway across the lot. I flipped on the high-powered beam and shone it on the rooftop, panning from the far left to the right. At first I was confused. None of the trees were moving at all. In fact, everything was eerily still. I continued the sweep and froze above room 8. The trees began moving in a flurry, the cracking creaking of branches being pushed out of the way thundering through the silence. Some animal had indeed gotten on the roof, and spooked by the light scampered off the side of the building above room 10. I flipped off the light, happy that I had scared whichever pest had gotten onto the roof. I walked the rest of the way to the dimly lit rooms and knocked gently on room 8. There was a minute before I could hear Tim's muted steps walk towards the door. He was in his night clothes and seemed rather peeved, but when I told him I had scared whatever it was off the building he smiled and nodded. He passed me a $5 for tip and I passed him the earplugs I had brought from the office. I told him to put those in just in case whatever was on the roof decided to come back. It was not uncommon for raccoons or squirrels to take trash and nuts up there, and then try to open them up against the rooftop. Tim thanked me again and shut the door. Before returning to the office I had considered checking in with Mr. Geiger to be sure that the noise had not disturbed him, but figured it better to call the phone next to his bed rather than make him walk across the room to the door. I entered the office and grabbed the phone over the counter. I dialed for room 10 and waited. There was no answer, and after 5 or 6 rings I hung up the phone. Whatever had fled the roof had not disturbed Mr. Geiger's rest, and it was better to leave him be. I returned to my chair behind the desk and pulled out a sandwich from my lunchbox, happy to return to the peace and quiet my job provided. Normally when working the night shift you should do a sweep of the lot at 12 a.m., 4 a.m., and then one last time before clocking out at 8. Because I had answered Tim's request to check the roof, I had already swept the parking lot once. But when the wall clock clicked 4 a.m. I was already beginning my sweep. I walked from the front door of the office to the road, sweeping my flashlight in front of me as I walked. Once or twice I could hear the branches of the great trees behind me creak and sway, and it unsettled me since seeing whatever it was dart across the roof. I had seen a couple different critters move across the treetops before, but nothing at that speed. And whatever it was had to be at least the size of a Labrador. But stranger things had happened and there were bears in the woods, so I shook it off. When I turned around and started walking back towards the tenant rooms, something stopped me. It was not the silence or the trees, it was something about the lot. Tim had his car parked near his room, but that was the only one. Had Mr. Geiger walked here? More than likely he was dropped off. I couldn't imagine with his size and gait that he could operate a vehicle. As I swept the light across the lot I began to smell something foul. Probably the carcass of some poor animal that had been caught as prey earlier. Maybe that was what had been on the roof, a fox carrying its snack. Then I noticed that Mr. Geiger's door was open. The smell, it seemed, was coming from near his room. It was possible that whatever had afflicted Mr. Geiger was making the smell, remembering the visits to the hospital to see my grandfather. Or maybe whatever had fled the roof had dropped its prey behind his room. I resolved to go check it out, hoping to avoid another call by either of my guests about the smell. I walked wide right of Mr. Geiger's room and shone my flashlight towards the back of the building. This area was not well maintained by the landscaping crew, and seemed to be overgrown with moss and rocks as ancient as the trees. The rocks were sometimes stacked in strange rows or piles, and I imagined that some drifters had used them as tables. Those rocks had always bothered me, but that wasn't what bothered me now. There was no smell here. The smell had disappeared around the back of the building, and that meant whatever was the source was either around front or in a room. I turned around and slowly walked towards the edge of the building where Mr. Geiger's room was located. The smell was definitely coming from 10. I made the mistake of inhaling through my nose and immediately gagged, coughing up a bout of phlegm. I covered my nose with my shirt and inched closer. The door was still cracked, the light within illuminating the door like some dark portal. I knocked softly and called out, "Mr. Geiger, this is the front desk, is everything okay?" I waited for a few seconds but there was no answer. Perhaps this was a medical issue that I was intruding on, and Mr. Geiger had opened the door to air out his room. Could he be hurt? I knocked louder and leaned my ear towards the door. The only sound was the TV within, hissing out some children singing the Itsy Bitsy Spider song on some late-night cartoon. I backed away from the door and paused. If Mr. Geiger was in trouble, I would have to go inside. The phone in the office took too long to call out from, and my cell phone was still charging and would need time to boot up. I knocked again and announced my entrance. I wish I had ran instead. I gently pushed open the door and glanced around the room. All at once I had taken in the room, and all at once wished I had never moved back here, never worked at this hotel. Above me the trees began to creak and crack. Inside the room, the bed remained untouched but the light on the side table had been turned on. Mr. Geiger's coat was discarded on a chair in the corner. The TV continued to hiss out that children's song. There, in front of the TV, was Mr. Geiger. He had collapsed face forward, his hat tumbling to the front door now near my feet. But what was most horrifying was that Mr. Geiger's hump had exploded outwards. His ribs shone in the TV's lights, poking out through flesh and muscle. The back of Mr. Geiger's head was also blown outwards, and I could see tiny puffs of the shag carpet poking through his now empty sockets. I staggered backwards, a scream trying to fight its way out of my throat. But no sound came. I turned and ran. I ran as fast as I could, sprinting towards the front office. I didn't look back. I remember hearing a loud banging on the roof of the hotel, fast and rapid. The animal had returned, but it was the least of my worries. I would need to call 911 as fast as possible. I threw open the office door and nearly vaulted over the counter, grasping at my cell phone. As it slowly came to life, I frantically punched in the code to call out from the office phone. Before I could reach the end, however, from across the lot came a loud crashing and blood-curdling scream. Tim had found the body. With my cell phone nearly ready, I ran outside again, hoping to find and calm Tim. I was not halfway across the parking lot before I stopped and froze. Tim's door was open and he was standing in the doorway. I waved to him and at first, he did not wave back. Then slowly, his arm raised and wagged back and forth. I took a step back. Fumbling, he took a step forward. Something was very wrong. My brain screamed at me to turn and flee. I couldn't understand why. Was he drunk? He was definitely walking like it. Had he not been so friendly before? There was nothing off about his attire except it seemed to be riding slightly high so that his stomach was no showing, as if he had a backpack on under the shirt. Was it the way his head was lolling to one side now? Or maybe it was the way he had stepped forward. The same way I had seen Mr. Geiger walk earlier. I took another step back. Before I could turn and run, the form of Tim scuttled towards me. I say scuttled because Tim's feet were no longer touching the ground. Instead, 4 massive spider-like legs were moving him forward, visible now that they had moved out from the darkness of his room. His bowed head slammed backwards from the sudden acceleration, and from his gaping mouth came a long, high-pitched scream I have never heard before and never wish to hear again. His arms and legs wagged lazily behind him, as if he were an outfit airing out to dry in the wind. The screaming came now. I screamed as loud as I could as I fled towards the street. My only hope was a passing car. A passing car that I could jump in to flee this nightmare. I ran into the road and turned left. I heard the car roaring towards me before I saw it. It was the same engine I had heard earlier. It was the high school punk making his rounds again. And if I didn't get out of the way, I would be flattened. I turned to jump, and was lucky to just miss being slaughtered. I thank God every day that whatever that was behind me was not so quick to dodge. Going what looked like 100 miles per hour, the car crashed into the nightmare. In those brief moments time seemed to slow, and I would gouge out my eyes if my mind would erase what those headlights had shown. It was like a massive spider, bigger than any human. And it was wearing Tim like a mask. The front forelegs of it were stuffed into Tim's form, working his arms and legs clumsily. Its head was probably in Tim's face, and I shudder to think whatever it used to pluck at Mr. Geiger's vocal cords. The car smashed into it and it flew into the darkness. Unfortunately the kid was not wearing his seatbelt, and was jettisoned through his windshield. I turned and fled. I didn't care who was alive or dead, only that I had the strength to run as far away as I could. The ancient trees on either side of me cracked and swayed as I ran. I ran and I screamed. I have no memory of being found, but the police told me they picked me up nearly 5 miles away with the bottoms of my shoes worn out. My feet had blistered and were sticky with blood. I had 1,000-yard stare in my eyes and only gave any kind of response when asked if I could go back to the hotel with them. I responded violently, kicking, screaming, and spitting. I refused. But I was handcuffed and taken back. I remember arriving. I had shut my eyes as tight as possible. The morning sun was just peeking out over the trees. I dared not look at the thing the car had hit in the light. It was bad enough to want to rip my brain out for seeing it in the headlights. I only opened my eyes when the police told me they had the situation under control. According to them, Tim had wandered into the street and was struck by the high school kid. The collision had obliterated Tim's body into a nearly unrecognizable mess. Mr. Geiger's body was still in the room, but medical analysis has yet to discover what caused his body to explode, and in their opinion I would later learn, it was built-up gases. His hat and jacket had disappeared as well. It wouldn't bother me that they would call me crazy behind my back when I told them the story. Or that they would call me mad when I whispered of the creature, and refer me to doctors that said I had imagined it all to cope with the trauma of seeing Tim hit by that car. No. What made me move was what I heard the police say. They let me out of the car and cuffs, and I slowly scanned the lot. I would be called crazy without a doubt. Tim's body had been flung some ways towards my office. There was no creature. There was only the car and Tim. You could see in the road where the kid had slammed on the brakes. You could see the streaks of blood and meat where his body had flown through the windshield. The cop must have noticed me staring. There was no kid in the street. Had he gotten up and stumbled away? The cop put a reassuring hand on my shoulder. Don't worry. We just got a call that someone matching his description stumbled into a hotel down the road. He was wearing a trench coat and hat, probably banged up and scared. We're gonna go get him some help. I will never go back. Story 12, Photographs, A Window to Dead Souls. You've heard the expression, the eyes are a window to the soul. It's a common English expression, but I've always been so confused by this saying. Eyes are eyes, nothing more. But photographs, they show much more and allow you to see into the soul of both the subject and the artist who captured it. The piece, lighting, contrast, and color all define the photographs I create as a professional. My art is a window into my own soul. I have always believed this. But since a recent occurrence, I have begun to question precisely how deeply a photograph may allow a viewer look. I've been capturing landscapes, modeled pieces, and a combination of the two for almost 50 years. But recently, I've found reason to believe that my photographs don't simply freeze a moment in time, they follow the subjects even after death. Especially after death. Models can be particularly dim-witted, I'm afraid to admit. The stereotype is quite accurate. Those who drink from the cup of beauty are sometimes passed over by the cup of knowledge. And so, as you might imagine in my line of work, photographers often comment on this anomaly. There's even a running joke among my colleagues that the reason models are so dull in personality and charm is because each photograph that is taken of them rips a portion of the model's soul from their body. This is all fun and games, of course. Photographers, at least professional ones, never belittle or degrade their models to their faces. I don't particularly enjoy participating in these juvenile discussions. This joke has roots though, it wasn't thought up by some self-righteous photographer pretending to know something about the world. As I understand it, in the late 19th to the early 20th century, Native American tribes still specked the western landscape. When white men began seeping into their territory, they brought their technology and strange devices with them, including the camera. These prototype cameras took anywhere from 20 minutes to 2 hours to capture a photograph, and it took even longer to develop them. But, despite these cameras' lack of convenient use, they were carried across the plains to document the landscape and its inhabitants. When these cameras were brought to photograph Native American tribes, they often refused. They believed that the process could steal a person's soul. And if one's soul was stolen, they would not be able to reunite with their tribe in the afterlife. It took many years, and many white men, to convince the natives that this was not the case with photographing, and eventually their beliefs were overpowered. They began to let the white men photograph them. One of my mother's more precious family heirlooms when she was alive was a photograph, the colors dull and faded with time and the image grainy, of my great-great-great-grandfather. In the photograph he wears a traditional feathered headdress and war paint under his eyes. Chief Hiawatha of a Cherokee tribe is written in cursive lettering below the photograph. This topic has special meaning to me and my people, my heritage and my family. So when I began to notice strange things happening in my photographs, this old legend that the Native Americans believed is the first thing my mind jumped to. This is my only explanation. Over time, the long-standing belief on photos that the Native Americans held began to be looked on as the beliefs of silly savages. I have found truth in this urban legend the past few days. It all began at a casting call I had for a shoot that would run over the course of 12 months. The idea was that each week, at precisely the same time in the same place, I would photograph a model to show the lighting differences and contrast during the changing seasons. It was to be used for academic purposes at a local university. I hate projects like these, they completely lack in creativity and individuality, but it would pay well. I figured I would take on the assignment as a side project and continue with my normal work. Normally, I would have somebody else choose my models after giving them a detailed list of what I was looking for, but for this shoot I wanted to be there. Because of the long-term commitment that would be required, many of my usual professional models declined the invitation to the casting call and I was left with amateurs. This frustrated me, but I remained positive, hoping that I would find a diamond in the rough. And I did just that. Out of respect, we will call her Margot, which is not her real name. I don't feel right using her real name, as I feel somehow responsible for what happened. Margot was bright and confident and, best of all, well-spoken. She was those things, as well as calm and offered a serene demeanor. Confidence and kindness is a rare combination. She was not talkative, but when she spoke each ear in the room turned to listen. Unlike other models, she had something to say that was worth listening to. We became friends almost instantly. She reminded me of my wife when she was young with black hair and piercing eyes. I had a fondness for Margot because of this. My wife had died years prior, and the sadness still rang true. Usually at auditions, models pay no mind to me. I am an old Native American man, and I usually stand in the corner. They assume I am a janitor or secretary and ignore me completely until I am introduced as the head photographer, then they usually rush to shake my hand. This is why I avoid casting calls. I don't enjoy being fawned over or kissed up to. But Margot was different. She made eye contact with me first when entering the room. She shook my hand first. Before the audition was over, I had already decided that she would be my model. We began the shoot mid-November of 2017. I had chosen a beautiful spot in the Rocky Mountains that captured the sunshine flooding the valley behind where the subject would stand. The chosen time was each Wednesday at 4:30 p.m. Margot would wear the same outfit for each shoot, and it was chosen to be a white t-shirt and regular blue jeans. The first few weeks were shot beautifully, the light was yellow and reflected off of the changing leaves in golden shimmers. Margot modeled perfectly. She was keen to procedure, despite her being an amateur. She stood exactly where she was supposed to and was never a moment late. As a matter of my own personal principle, I always take two of the same photograph. One digital and one film. I learned to photograph on a film camera and have always loved how soft and subtle the light shines on film. The colors, although less vibrant, have a vintage look that remind me of who I was before I inhabited this old body. The digital photographs would be slightly retouched and then sent to the university executives that oversaw my project. I kept the film photographs to keep as a part of my own personal collection. Over my 50 decades of photographing, I had acquired countless photos of family, strangers, models, and landscapes that I kept in my attic. Margot's photos were no different. Each time, I took one on my digital camera and one on my film camera to be developed later in my darkroom. As we slid through December and into January, the shoots became less enjoyable than they were in the late fall. The lighting was always too dark and the pictures never came out just right. But that was the point that the project was trying to show, I suppose. Different seasons and times produce different lighting and contrast. I only began to like the photos again in mid-March. The light grew softer and brighter and the trees began to grow leaves again. Not to mention the working conditions were more enjoyable because it wasn't below freezing outside anymore. But just before the best was to come, tragedy struck. One Wednesday afternoon, while traveling to the spot we had traveled to almost 20 times previously, I sat in the passenger seat, with Margot and the lighting assistant sat in the back. Suddenly a front tire blew and the driver lost control. We rolled down the canyon cliffside and landed 150 feet below in a ravine. Margot did not survive. I attended her funeral a week later. I provided the photo that would stand next to her closed casket. I chose to use the first photo that I took back in November. The yellow light and shimmering leaves were as beautiful as I remember them to be. Even though I liked the film version better, I used the digital version because the quality was better when it was enlarged. I offered the photo to Margot's family as a keepsake, but they declined. They were not outrightly angry with me, but I think they believe me to be the cause of her death. I believe it too. I didn't know Margot well, but death does strange things to the mind. Margot's loss felt like my wife's loss all over again. I sank into a depression and halted all of my projects except Margot's. The university executives coldly suggested that I find a similar-looking model to finish the project when I delivered the news of Margot's death. The students won't notice a difference, they had said. So I found a similar-looking model and continued the project so I could pay my rent. The new girl was dull, and I hated her. I didn't want the photo that had stood by Margot's casket, but I didn't have the heart to throw it away. So, I stored it and the other photos of Margot in my attic with the rest of my film collection and old memorabilia. Since then, I largely forgot about the photographs of Margot and moved on with my life. Over the months, I picked up more projects and began enjoying my work again. Creating has a way of pulling you from any deep and dark hole that might consume you. But a few days ago, on August 14th, which marked the 6-month anniversary of Margot's death, I felt the deep sadness creep upon me again. I decided I would visit the attic and reminisce on my younger years and the things I had created, but when I pulled the ladder from the ceiling and crept, with my old bones and creaking joints up and up and up, the temperature got cooler. This was unusual, as my attic is not connected to the central heating and cooling system, and thus it reflects the outside temperature. In the middle of August, I expected the temperature in the attic to be in the mid to high 80s. I kept climbing and found myself wishing for a sweater. But my old bones only had so much in them. I was afraid if I went down the stairs, I wouldn't be able to go back up again. I walked between the rows and rows of stacked boxes to locate the photo that stood next to Margot's casket. It was covered in a terry cloth sheet in the corner of the room, and when I removed it I found it as beautiful as I had remembered it. The yellow light, my favorite part, and Margot both shined brightly. Though, now the photo was flecked with sadness and guilt. I wept for Margot's loss and for my own losses over the years. I located the box that contained the film photos of Margot, the title on the box simply being M. 2017-18, as I opened it and pulled a small stack from it, my hands began to shake at what my eyes saw. What I thought to be a trick of the light manifested itself in full horror. The landscape and lighting behind Margot had remained the same, but where Margot had once stood was now left without her presence. Instead, a rotting skeleton, thin and shriveled with protruding eyes and straw-like black hair, replaced her. I dropped the box and stood staring at my feet and the pile of photos. Without thinking, I rushed to the first box I had ever stored here. The title read My Sweetheart, 1968 to 2006. I had not opened this box since her funeral. Inside I expected to find the photos I collected from my wedding and other events I had shared with her throughout my life. This box was largest, as I had taken thousands of film photographs over the years I spent with her. When I opened the box, I removed the first photograph that I had ever taken of my darling and inspected it closely. Instead of the youthful-looking young woman with long black hair and piercing eyes I remember so clearly, I found a rotted corpse again, mouth agape and skin shriveled like old parchment paper. I pushed through the photographs, looking for one that hadn't been touched by the poisonous hand of death, but found none. Since then, I have burned my film photograph collection. All of the people in my photos that are now dead were replaced by a rotting corpse. It seems that photographs, at least film ones, can capture a piece of the subject's soul. My photos held fast to that piece of soul, even into death. Story 13, Splash Mountain. So I've only been to Disney World twice in my life. The first time I went was 10 years ago. I went with my family, who consists of my 2 brothers, my mother and my father, and 10 years later, they decided to treat me and my brothers to a trip to Disney World for doing well in school. They brought us during February, which was weird, considering that we would have our summer vacation in a few months, but, to be fair, it was really quiet there, so that was good. At the time, one of my favorite rides to go on was Splash Mountain. But before all that, my parents figured that my brothers should choose the rides first, as I got to choose them 10 years ago. I agreed and we had a fun time. But as the park began to close, though, we began to head for Splash Mountain. I said to my family that I had to pee, and my mother asked me to take my little brother, who was 10 years old, BTW. My older brother was 18, with me as he had to go too. I obliged and went with him to the bathroom. When we returned, nobody was there. It was like a ghost park. My brother asked where our family was, and just as I was about to talk, we saw that the lights that belonged to Splash Mountain were on. I decided that maybe our family was waiting inside for us. We walked in there to find nothing. No family, no guards, nothing. I was about to leave when my brother said he wanted to go on the ride. I wanted to say no, but I couldn't think of any reason to. Looking back on this now, I really wish I had just gotten out of there. But, of course, I had no way of knowing what would happen on that ride. We boarded the boat and my brother seemed really excited. I would be, if it weren't for the fact that our family couldn't find us and we couldn't find them. I mentioned that to my brother, and he told me to just make the most of the ride, as it'll be the last time we'll be coming down here for a while. I realized he was right and just tried my best to enjoy the ride. The first odd thing about this ride was the animatronics. Now, these animatronics are from the film Song of the South and try to entertain you throughout the ride. However, I noticed that the white bird's eyes were fixated on me and my brother. I didn't mention it to him, as I didn't want to creep him out. But when I looked back, they were still staring intently at us. Then we passed Brer Fox and Brer Bear, but they weren't the same. Brer Bear had a truly horrifying look on his face, and had an sharp axe. Brer Fox had really sharp teeth, and a truly hate-filled look about him. They spoke, but they were so quiet that I couldn't hear them. However, I could make out one word, a word that nobody would expect to hear in anything Disney-related. I heard Brer Fox say murder. I couldn't believe it. I thought this was a dream, so I pinched myself, but I then realized that this was all real. Disney wouldn't do something like this, would they? The Laughing Place song played, but something about it was off. I didn't know what was off, but I knew that it wasn't the same fun song that I had heard 10 years earlier. I knew, at that point, that I had to get off this ride. But I couldn't. I then heard my brother scream. I asked him what was wrong, and he pointed at something. It was one of the animatronics, lying face down in the water, not moving an inch. There seemed to be defensive wounds, meaning that the thing fought back viciously to survive, but succumbed. There was a red liquid, presumably blood, that surrounded its body. There was only one problem: I didn't recognize the animatronic from Song of the South, or any Disney movie to be exact. My brother started crying and I told him, in a comforting voice, that it wasn't real, but deep down, I wasn't sure whether it was real or not. Then we saw that Brer Fox and Brer Bear had captured Brer Rabbit. The rabbit looked like he was legitimately upset, and pleaded with the two to let him go. Brer Bear then brutally and horrifically decapitated him. Blood was seeping from his open neck, as his severed head floated into the water. Brer Fox and Brer Bear then looked at us and started laughing. Not playful, or kid-friendly laughing. This sounded threatening and the way I imagined a deranged psychopath would laugh. My brother screamed, and I threw up into the water. The waterfall came around, but at this point, we were scared. We just wanted to leave. The waterfall was our favorite part of the ride, though, so we tried our best to enjoy it. We went down the waterfall, and we screamed out of excitement and terror. When we dropped down to the bottom of the hill outside, I said, "Did you enjoy the waterfall, brother?" No answer. James? Nothing. I looked left, to see that my brother wasn't on the boat anymore. I was hysterical. As I passed by more animatronics, I screamed at the top of my voice that my brother was missing. I didn't get any sort of a response, but I swear I could hear one of the animatronics quietly saying good. I spent the rest of the ride crying and screaming for James. After the ride, the boat stopped at some platforms, and I was both thankful that the nightmare was finally over, and worried as my brother had disappeared in what was often nicknamed the happiest place on earth. I took out my phone and tried to call my parents, but my battery had died. Fuck, I had forgotten to charge it before I arrived. Just then, the lights went out, and I heard loud footsteps from the darkness of the platform. It kept walking, until it reached the edge of the platform. My boat started rocking. It rocked so much that I actually thought I was going to fall off. I started crying again. All I wanted was to find my brother, and I then heard one word that I still remember today. Whatever was on the platform whispered into my ear, "James." I got out of that ride so fast I don't even remember running. My family was waiting outside for me. I was stuttering like crazy, telling them about all the scary shit that I had seen on Splash Mountain. When I told my mom that my brother James was missing, the look on her face was one of sadness and heartbreak. At that moment, I wanted to die. I couldn't believe that my brother, my own brother, was missing, and it was completely my fault. The police were called and, around an hour later, they somberly informed us that my brother was found dead in the water. He was at the very bottom of the water. My mother burst into tears then and there, while me, my father and my older brother quietly cried to ourselves. At first, I figured that my brother had just drowned. But the autopsy revealed something interesting. My brother had actually died from extreme head injuries, not from the water. Life hasn't been the same since. My mother and father don't speak to me anymore. My older brother turns erratic when he's in the same room as I am. James's funeral was really sad. Lots of mourners came and paid respects to him. I often think about the figure that I heard in the platform, and what his intentions were. I also think about what me and James saw in the water that night, and how James met a eerily similar fate, besides the blood obviously. Maybe that thing that we saw lying face down in the water that night wasn't really an animatronic. Story 14, Alone. I was home by myself when it all happened. My parents had to go on a business trip while I stayed home by myself for 2 days. This was the first time my parents had decided to leave me at home overnight. I was very nervous when they announced that a few days ago. My only sibling, my older brother, was 20 and staying in an apartment until he could afford a house. My mother told me that if I got sick or hurt I could call my older brother. I didn't care for my older brother Zach that much. He smoked pot and couldn't keep a girlfriend for more than a month. I decided against having him over because I never knew when he might be drunk or high. He would invite all of his friends over, and they would trash the house then go run off to wherever they usually go. Once my parents left, I watched TV for a couple of hours, but I eventually got bored of it. The sun had almost set, which meant it was almost time for me to go to bed. I got undressed, brushed my teeth, and got into bed. I was playing on my tablet and chatting with my friends via text message until about 11 o'clock. I was about to turn off my tablet when the power suddenly flickered, then went out. At first, I wondered what could have made the power go out until I looked outside. All of my neighbors' lights were on, so I figured I had blown a fuse. After all, I did have all of the lights on in the house at the time. I grabbed my flashlight and headed downstairs. When I got to the basement, my flashlight started to dim and flicker. The basement was barren and cold. We never went in the basement unless we had to clean out the mouse traps. I needed to hurry to get the power back on before I couldn't see anything at all. My flashlight cast eerie shadows across the walls. The shadows danced as I moved. I started to become frightened when my flashlight dimmed even more. The shadows on the wall seemed to mock me for my cowardice. I heard something squeak beneath my toe. When I looked down I saw a fat rat with one ear torn almost completely off. It scampered away when I shouted at it. I could see the fuse box just a few feet away. The fuse box was like a light at the end of a dark, deep tunnel. That fuse box would bring me comfort and it would scare away the monsters that lived in my mind. I was within arm's reach of the fuse box when a loud hissing noise startled me, and I threw my flashlight at it. It seemed to be a rat I had almost crushed. I couldn't tell where anything was because everything was pitch black. When I threw my flashlight at the noise, my flashlight must have broken. I started grasping in the dark trying to find my bearings. The monsters in my mind were growing, feeding on my fear. They were taking over my subconscious. The monsters in my head had grown so much after that flashlight had broken that a rat wasn't a small animal anymore. It was a giant, vicious creature ready to take a chunk out of me if I got too close. The cold, hard floor wasn't the floor anymore. It was a death trap. If I took a wrong step I would fall into the earth's core. I reached into the darkness when I found something. I pulled on it, but it wouldn't budge. Then, I tried to pull it forward when, snap. I yelped in surprise and pain. I hadn't found the fuse box, I had almost just broken my fingers in a mouse trap. I pried the trap off and yelled again. I was still trying to find the box when my hand fell upon a lever. I was reluctant to pull it because of what had just happened. But, curiosity killed the cat and I pulled. Then, the room flooded with light. I had found the fuse box. I danced upstairs back to my room and turned off all the lights in the house except for the one in my room. The experience in the basement had rattled me too much. I pulled the covers over me and fell right asleep. I woke up with a startle. I hadn't known why I woke up. I just did. Maybe it had been a loud noise from outside. I looked at the clock and found that it was 3 a.m. I was about to get up and get a glass of water when I felt something tickle my feet. Goosebumps shot up my body as I looked down. It appeared to be the legs of a spider crawling up my bed. I had heard the phrase frozen in fear, but I never really understood it. But now I did. I tried to scream, I tried to move, but I couldn't. It was like I was trapped inside my body, unable to move. The legs got bigger and they kept crawling. They kept getting bigger and bigger until they looked like a hand trying to find its way up onto my bed. The hand was black and wrinkled. It started tugging at my feet and trying to pull me down. I couldn't yell, I couldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear. The hand kept tugging. Then, a slow, raspy whisper said, "I want your skin." Story 15, Sub-Basement. Hey all. A few weeks back my family and I visited York, Nebraska to celebrate my grandma's 80th birthday. Everyone was there. My parents, brother, all 12 of my aunts and uncles, and 13 cousins. Needless to say, I would not be alone in my grandparents' home. I've always loved the house. It's a generous-sized two-story home. When I was younger, and still to this day, I've always thought it was unique because it has a basement as well as a sub-basement, so another story below the basement. It was cool, but it was still another basement to be afraid of as a little kid. I'll try my best to explain the layout for y'all. When you open the door, you're greeted by a set of 4 steps, which has its own light switch. A dim little light above the stairs. The main room is illuminated by one ceiling light. The carpet is as hard as rocks, might as well be hardwood floors, but you still get the carpet burn. As you enter, there is a door to your right that leads into freezer room where an extra fridge, freezer, and other pantry items live. It also has the switches to turn on the main room light and freezer. When you leave the room, there is an open closet to the far left of the room, not visible when you first enter the sub-basement. The basement always gave me the heebie-jeebies. I never liked how you couldn't see everything no matter where you were standing. However, I'm 21 now, so I'm over it for the most part. So all 30 of us are crammed in the house. Drinking, laughing, playing marbles. I'm asked to make a beer run, so I hop down to the sub-basement, and just as I close the door I realize I'm alone. It seems so quiet even though I can hear the muffled voices 2 stories above. I flip the light switch to the main room, and flip the switch to the freezer room before I can even see how dark it is in there. Maybe I'm a pansy, but I still don't like looking into dark rooms. As I am grabbing cans of beer, out of the corner of my eye I see the main room light go off. Even though I figure it was a little cousin messing with me, every ounce of fear I've ever felt as a kid returned in that moment. I didn't hear the door open and I didn't hear any steps. When I think back on it now, I should have just walked out and back upstairs to rejoin the party. I leave the freezer room and I feel for the switch in the darkness. I didn't want to look away. I wasn't prepared. I don't think anyone would have been. The light flicked on. There was a man in the closet, half concealed by the door frame. He wasn't looking at me, and he didn't move. There was nothing cosmetically unsettling about him except for the fact that he was an unfamiliar man in the basement of my grandparents' house. I let out as much air as shell-shocked body could. It was pathetic. My head felt light, the tunnel vision starting creeping in, and my knees were about to give out. I moved as quickly as I could to the door without turning my back, but as soon as the closet was out of sight I sprinted upstairs. I alerted my family. I shouldn't have. My uncles were the first to run down to check. I just stood at the top of the steps leading to the main basement, but when they came up they told me there was no one downstairs. Of course. But listen, I know what I saw. Luckily my family is one giant support group, so they didn't ridicule me for being delusional, at least not to my face. I have so many questions. Who was he? Was he there when I first entered the basement? Where did he go? I don't believe the house is haunted, as I have never experienced anything before, and the house is maybe 40 years old. My grandpa built it, so no one else has ever lived there. I won't be going back for some time. We don't make trips out there very often, but please, if anyone has had a similar experience, please share or tell me what this could be and if my grandparents are in danger. Story 16, The Sleeping Security Guard. Ever since I dropped out of university, the only jobs I ever had was in the security sector, and I will be honest, I didn't get my SIA security license through legal means but knew someone who could get me in SIA license for a price. I had contacts with all sorts of people within the security sector, which is how I got jobs in the first place, and in this profession it's all about who you know rather than what you know. I bet you don't feel safe now knowing what the security industry is really like, but it's actually just reality, and the types of people who tend to get jobs in the security sector are people with hardly any skills in real life nor any motivation to do anything real with their lives. We just cannot be bothered to do things, and we are quite lazy, and as I am admitting this, I guess protection is the last thing in most people's minds who work in security. Don't get me wrong, there are some who work in security because they want to protect people, but the majority are like me. The money is high and the hours are long, but you get used to it, and I prefer the mornings instead of nights. I just cannot seem to stay awake throughout the whole night for some odd reason, even when I have had enough sleep in the morning. I am simply not a night person, and each security job requires every security guard to do nights and mornings. I have been caught many times by multiple managers and multiple security companies resorting to taking pictures of me sleeping on the job on a night shift. Managers always check on their security employees, especially the ones working the night shift, and every security job I got fired from I managed to get a new one because I knew someone. One skill I did have in this world is knowing how to make friends and making contacts. Damn it, I wish I was determined to do something proper with my life, but I just don't have any motivation at all. Looking at Facebook picture of people I used to go to school with and seeing them travel the world and living life to the full, and here I am doing hardly anything as a security guard. Anyway, I got fired from another security job for sleeping throughout the night shift at a construction site, and I got caught because I was answering my phone and my manager came down and caught me snoozing through the window. I was instantly told to go home. The worst types of people to work with during a night or morning shift are security guards who used to be soldiers or police officers, because they always see everything as a duty and always so straightforward, if you know what I mean. Anyhow, I managed to find another security company through my contacts, and this security company looked after old abandoned buildings, and the company paying them to protect old abandoned buildings is part of the council. Some of these old abandoned buildings are over 100 years old, and there is a group of people who want to preserve them and make sure they are protected. It was all night work though, because in the morning these old abandoned buildings are museums for the public to enter and learn about them and their history. Now, at first it got me worried when I was told that it was all night work, but when I also got told that no manager checks up on their guard at night or any buttons to press around the building, I was instantly relieved. I could snooze throughout the night with no fear of getting caught, and each security guard is alone in each shift. It's 4 days on and then 4 days off. At that point it felt like I had won a lottery ticket and finally a job I could see myself doing for the rest of my life. The area was the safest area I had ever worked in, and I didn't worry about burglars or troublesome kids trying to break into any old building I was guarding while sleeping at the same time. No one is going to check the CCTV cameras unless there was a break-in or some kind of trouble arising and someone needing to check what had happened the night before. Overall, I felt at peace and finally found the right place to work in, and I was looking forward to starting my first night shift with this company. The old building I was guarding was over 200 years old and was a popular museum for people to visit, and it wasn't so big nor so small. On my first night shift I made sure to do my walk arounds the old building and just making sure everything was locked and tidy before I put my feet up in the office, which was behind the reception I was supposed to maintain all night. I pulled up a couple of chairs and I brought myself a small cushion from home and wished myself a good night. The shift was 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. and I decided to go to sleep around 11 p.m. after making sure everything was locked and secured. As I closed my eyes and dozing off into dream world, I started thinking about chat I had with the manager who interviewed me for this job. When he told me that they didn't check on their security guards at night nor any kind of check, I jokingly replied, "So how do you know if they are sleeping or not?" And the manager replied, "Well, we kind of don't have to, that bit of the job is already covered." And I remember being confused by it but just nodded on. I was wondering by what he meant by that, and as I started dozing off into a much deeper sleep and that heavenly feeling when tiredness commands are being met, all I remember is being flipped into the air, and as I hit the ground all I screeched was, "What the fuck?" When I came to my senses, the multiple chairs I gathered within the office were now connected to each other to make a pyramid shape on the table. I disconnected all of them and tidied up the office and made my bed again by using the chairs and decided to go to sleep again, hoping nothing would happen again. I was really tired at this point, and when I dozed off I could feel myself going into a deep sleep. Around 3 a.m. I felt this horrible draft of cold air all over my body and that disgusting feeling of vulnerability you get when discomfort feeling hits you, like waking up early in the morning on a cold winter's morning. I then felt hardness around my head and body, and when I opened my eyes I confusingly found myself not in the office but upstairs with the window open. I was sleeping on the floor, and when I got up I felt terrible, and I was thinking to myself whether I had slept-walked, but I had never slept-walked in my life. I checked the CCTV cameras and it didn't show me sleepwalking, but when I checked the CCTV in the upstairs areas in this old building where I found myself waking up in such discomfort. At first the cameras were showing absolutely nothing in the upstairs areas, and then everything went black, and when the cameras came into focus again I could now see myself sleeping on the hard floor with the windows open. I was still tired but so frightened, and I turned on the heater where I kept on nodding off and then waking up while maintaining the reception as I was supposed to do. The next shift I found myself more exhausted than ever, and I made sure everything was locked and decided to go to sleep around 11 p.m. I went into the office and gathered a few chairs and made my bed. As I started dozing off I could feel pain all over my body, and it was as if something was digging its claws all over my body. I couldn't take the pain anymore, and I got up and went into the bathroom where I inspected my body. I had nail marks all over my body and some parts of my body were bleeding and bruised. I got some cold water and wiped my body down and decided to try and sleep again around 4 a.m. and when I tried to go to sleep again I could feel pressure around my neck area. I could feel my body going from deep sleep to light sleep whenever pressure was applied to my neck, and when I awoke I found myself standing on a chair on the 3rd floor with a rope around my neck. The rope was connected to one of the chandeliers which was newly installed into this old building, and I managed to keep my balance on the chair and pull the rope off my neck, and I jumped down onto the floor. That whole week I didn't sleep one bit, and my body wasn't reacting well to staying awake the whole night, and the depression I felt was unimaginable. I managed to get the contact of the other security guard David, who also does nights at the same building I work at, and through text I managed to learn he too has experienced the same thing. He told me that as time goes by things become more extreme, and just dozing off lightly might make you end up in a situation you will not want to be. He once ended up outside in the canal water when he decided to doze off in the office. Luckily he was a good swimmer and he swam back to safety, and just hearing him tell me these stories it made me rethink about working at the old building. David expressed to me that he had finally found another job and has told our manager that he was going to stay for one last month working in the 200-year-old building. I was happy for him, and I myself was on the search for another job, and on another night shift I was so exhausted even though I had enough sleep in the mornings I was still tired. I tried changing my diet and exercising a bit more, but I always felt tired in the night shift, and like I said I just wasn't a night person. I fell asleep in the office once again, and that great safe feeling of sleep coming over my body, and as I went into a deep sleep I could feel this horrible cold feeling coming over me. I could also feel another person next to me, and as I woke up I found myself on the 2nd floor of the building with David's dead body next to me. I screamed and rushed downstairs trying to make sense of everything that has just happened. I phoned the ambulance and the police, all the while texting my manager, and when they took his body my manager came to the site. He looked at me and all he said was shouldn't be sleeping on the job, and then I thought about the remark he made when he first interviewed. He said he doesn't really have to check whether his security guards are sleeping on the job or not because something else is making sure we are not sleeping on the job. I wanted to give up working for him, and I didn't want to work for this security company anymore. My manager smiled and all he said was it's not really up to us whether you can leave or not, and he just walked away with no care in the world. When I went home I made sure to never go back, but when I went to bed but then I could feel chairs under my back, and when I awoke I was back in the office. I contacted my manager and all he said to me was we do not have control who goes, and I hopelessly went back into the office and lying down on the chairs I tried to go to sleep. Sometimes I would get flipped off or something would be scratching my body to keep me awake. I miss just being able to go to sleep with no disturbance or fear of something happening to me, and I regret ever taking this job as I am not a night person and never will be. Story 17, The Butterfly Bracelet. Something really freaky happened last night. I was sitting at my laptop reading true crime stories as I usually do, when I suddenly realized the world around me had stopped. Like, The birds were stuck in midair, my fish in the tank stopped swimming around, and my star's nightlight had paused, though it is usually moving, so the stars dance on my ceiling. Now, I'm not usually one to believe in magic, but this was simply magical. I couldn't believe it when I looked down and became aware of the fact that I was simply playing with the bracelet my mum gave me. It reminded me of the times I was younger and I'd see butterflies always flying around my mum, dancing in her hair almost as the sun shone down on us. I guess I'll need to tell you about my mum first for this to make a bit of sense. My mother was the most amazing person in the whole world. She was beautiful, kind and thoughtful. My dad simply adored her. He worshipped the ground she walked on and did the same with me when I was born. She would always tell me, never listen to what mean people have to say about you, they will always just simply be jealous of you. And I know a lot of people get told this by their parents, but the way my mum said it really made me believe it. She was the most pure and wholesome being on the entire planet. Not everybody thought so. Everyone has people who simply didn't like them, and unfortunately for my dear mum, hers was a nasty group of parents from the school. There were 3 of them, Cindy, Caroline, and Kathy. Their names all began with a C because they were all cool anyway. As I was saying, they really didn't like my mum. They made it their mission to make her miserable, talking badly about her to anyone who would listen. Fortunately for mum, this wasn't many people. One day my gorgeous and unsuspecting mama was on her way home with the groceries. Her car broke down and by pure coincidence the 3 bitches were driving past. They decided rather than helping her, they'd kidnap her and keep her hostage for a month. In this month they starved her, mutilated her and fed her lies about me, convincing her I'd failed at school due to her disappearance, when in fact I had been given time off by the principal, who was understanding and kind-hearted, that being one of the only things keeping me sane during her disappearance, not forgetting the bracelet. The day my mum was found, was the last day of her life. She didn't die, but she is now in a mental institution due to her trauma. Although the 3 C's were tried and jailed for what they did, I still want my revenge. Though I know my mum would never let me. But I must, I need to get my revenge, for my mum. And this is what I was thinking about while twirling the bracelet round my wrist. I didn't think it had anything to do with the fact I had managed to stop time, but I certainly realized the second time. I was riding on the bus when an old man came and sat next to me. I wasn't doing anything particularly special that day, I was only going to the mall for some new clothes, but this man was staring at me and wouldn't stop. I was feeling uncomfortable, sure, but he hadn't made a move or anything, so I decided to keep quiet. When he reached down and put his hand on my thigh, I gasped and suddenly time stopped. It just stopped. It gave me time to get away, and I was crying, and after I'd started walking a bit, time started again. I don't know why, I don't know what to do. Why me? Why can I stop time? And what do I do with this information? Story 18, I finally feel safe enough to talk about growing up in a haunted house. Growing up, my house was haunted, and whatever was haunting it was malicious. I had 3 or 4 terrifying and soul-shattering reoccurring nightmares for about 10 years, the worst being the hanging tree. In the dream, I walked in on my uncle and my mom talking. My uncle's back was to me and he was telling my mom not to go somewhere. I asked him where he was talking about, and he turned around and looked at me with piercing red eyes and a jagged smile from ear to ear and said, "The hanging tree." I screamed and woke up, or I thought I was awake. I got out of bed and went to the living room, where I could hear a thunderstorm going on. I always loved the smell of thunderstorms and walked outside so I could further observe. I opened the door and it was pitch black outside. And then lightning struck, and in the light I could see it. It was a tall oak tree, at least 30 feet. It was dead and had no leaves, and from its branches had 15 or 20 ropes hanging from it, and half of them were currently being used. I immediately dropped to my knees and started screaming and crying into my hands. I woke up and then slept in my parents' bed. I've never been as terrified as I was that night. I was also prone to sleep paralysis. Back then I didn't know what it was, I just knew I would wake up and I couldn't move my body, which that in itself was terrifying. Now, I always slept with my door open, just in case I ever got trapped in my room with whatever was in that house. There was one night when I woke up from a dream and couldn't move. Immediately I knew this night was gonna suck. My blanket was just above my eyes, so I was blind to my surroundings, and what pursued makes me grateful for that. I could hear something in my room, moving about. I was thinking maybe it's my cat, who slept in bed with me every night, no big deal. And then I heard a creaking noise coming from my door, like it was moving. And then I heard it latch. My fucking door closed. I knew that this was it, I was gonna die right here, and I couldn't even scream. I heard my cat hiss, and then it jumped off the bed. And something started to get on the bed. It gripped my leg and used it to pull itself up onto the bed. After it was on, it started crawling its way up my body, where it stopped at my chest. I could feel it pressing down on my chest. And it kept pressing, harder and harder, until I could no longer breathe. I don't remember what happened after that. I assume I passed out from fear, because the next thing I did was wake back up. I jumped out of bed, opened my door, and ran and cried in my mom's lap. There was another time when I had to go to the bathroom. My mom and sister were sitting in the living room talking about my grandma who had just died. And while I'm sitting on the toilet, something starts to scratch at the door, fast and hard, trying to get in. I kinda thought it was my sister, but I also thought, why would she go from talking about my dead grandma to trying to scare me? And then I opened the door and there was nobody there. I immediately sprinted back to the living room. They both asked me what was wrong, and I wouldn't tell them. I just sat clutching my knees in my arms, sitting on the couch. There was one time I saw what was haunting my house. Like I said, I always slept with my door open. From my bed, in the hallway, I could see out of the hallway window. I lived in a trailer, and that window was about 10 feet in the air. One night a little past midnight, I was laying in bed trying to sleep, and I heard a knock come from my door. I opened my eyes and I saw a head, a large head, walk past that window from the outside. I couldn't see any facial details, just the outline of a head, a large forehead that dropped to its eyes and then protruded to a long, thick nose and then receded in at the lips. I wanted to run to my parents' room more than anything, but I knew that the second I walked out of my bedroom door that I would have been less than 5 feet from where I saw it last, and that it was still there, waiting for me to do just that. I couldn't take it anymore, and I cried and I kept crying. My dad finally heard me and came into my room and asked what was the matter. When I told him, he didn't believe me, but he escorted me to their bed, and then I felt safe. Then, in 2009, it got me. Whatever it waste had been scaring me for 10 years had finally broken me down enough and decided to take control. My parents were in bed and my sister was watching TV in the living room. I don't remember a lot about that night, and what I do remember was like being drunk. Only being able to hang on to moments of my consciousness at a time. I remember playing with my Beyblades set. I had just spun 2 of my Beyblades into my small purple arena and was watching them smack into each other. I got up before they were done battling and went to the kitchen and grabbed some matches. The next thing I remember was my bed on fire and I was tossing lit matches into the flames. I couldn't stop. I still believe that the only reason my family and I are alive today is because I had a couple of Black Cat firecrackers on my bedstand that went off, which caused my dad to come and check on me. When he saw the flames, he grabbed me and yelled to my mom that the house was on fire. He ran me and my sister outside and told us to go get the water hose. He tried to put it out, but it was too late. The house was engulfed. We lost everything in that fire. Luckily there were no casualties, except the cat I had. My parents said they found him under my bed. That was the last time I ever encountered anything like that. Story 19, An Experience with Death. My name is James Kaufman. I had to kill my stalker. But he didn't stay dead. Please, if you see him, tell somebody. You're not crazy. This is my story. I was 17 when it started. Nobody else could see him, he made sure of that. I thought I was hallucinating. I saw Dr. Lewinsky, who prescribed me some medication. It didn't help. A man dressed in all black, hood and robes, with a sword. He looked like some freaky cosplayer for one of those Lord of the Rings things. Ring wraiths. He started appearing when I was alone, walking down the alley by my apartment, at the park, you get the idea. I tried calling the cops. They never found him. I couldn't get a photo of him, they thought I was giving them a load of horse shit. He never showed up when anyone else was around. I didn't know what to do. I started carrying weapons. First a knife, then a gun. The appearances went on for months. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. The next time he shows up, I told myself, I'll show him what's what. I devised what I thought was a terrible, but logical, plan. I'd wait until nightfall. I'd go to the alley. Wait for him there. Confront him. Simple, but dangerous. Finally, I decided it was time. He was showing up in my nightmares now, and I wanted him gone. That was September 27, 2017. I was 18 then. It started well enough. I checked the magazine on my handgun, a Sig Sauer P938. Full. I hoped I didn't have to use it. I walked to the elevator, mentally preparing myself for what might happen. As I left the lobby and walked to the side of the building, a wave of panic took over me. I stopped for a second, and then carried on. I wasn't going to let this stalker follow me anymore. It was time to end this, hopefully peacefully. I waited in the alley for half an hour. No dice. I hoped people didn't think I was suspicious. Then I laughed at the thought. If only they knew. Finally, my patience ran out. I turned to leave, and there he stood, sword vertical, glinting in the weak moonlight. His robes fluttered in the breeze. I marched toward him. I was closer to the end of the alley, which meant he couldn't back out. If he didn't want people seeing him, what do you want with me? I asked him. I had to strain not to shout, but I couldn't attract attention. He still had a sword in his hands. I am Thanatos, god of death. Your time is at an end, James Kaufman. His voice was low and rough. Yeah, right, you delusional freak. How the hell do you know my name? You would not understand, he intoned. If he was trying to scare me, it wasn't working. I was just infuriated. Now try me, you son of a bitch. I do not take insults lightly, boy. It's time to die. I don't know who you think you are, but you don't want to do this. One chance, back off now. Leave me alone. By way of answer, he charged me, closing the 20-yard gap between us in a few seconds. He swung his sword, but thankfully, it was hard to use in the narrow alley. I sidestepped, and pulled my gun on him. His blade didn't waver, it remained pointed at my chest, a few feet away. Last chance. I will shoot you. I didn't want to, but he'd already tried to kill me. He'd been following me for months. The man raised his sword, and before he could swing, I pulled the trigger. The bullet hit him square in the chest, almost point blank. He staggered, but before he dropped his sword, he tried to swing again, weakly. I shot again, and his blade clanged on the concrete floor. He fell on his back, and stayed there. I couldn't tell how much blood he was losing, but I knew that he'd be dead within the minute. I knelt next to him, and pulled his hood back. I fell back. It was my father. The man who'd murdered my mother, abused me as a child, and then left me for dead. I'd envisioned my revenge on my father time and time again, but I'd never expected this. I pulled out my cell, and dialed 911. I informed the operator of what had happened, and my location. To my own surprise, I started to cry. I don't even know why. I didn't love him. He'd made my life miserable, murdered my mother. He deserved to die. But I cried nonetheless. When the ambulance arrived, I almost followed them. When the police showed up to question me, my voice was hoarse. I was let go, no charges pressed. Self-defense. There was no family to press charges, anyway, just me. And I doubted a douchebag like him had many friends. Things in my life went slowly back to normal. I kept attending college. I occasionally had a night out with friends. I found a girlfriend, Abby, and she surprisingly doesn't blame me for killing a man. Then things went wrong. May 17, 2018. I was at the park, with Abby, enjoying the sunny day, when I saw the man in black for the first time in almost 8 months. I did a double take, and he was gone. I told her about it, and we agreed it was likely some kind of PTSD. July 5, 2018. I saw him again, early in the morning, looking out the window in my apartment. I don't know why my apartment had a window, it just looked out to the next building. But I looked down in the alley, and he was there, examining the spot where I'd shot him last year. But that was impossible. He had to be dead. But there he was. I got a picture on my cell, but most people call it a fake. Yesterday, August 17, 2018. I hadn't seen him for a month. But there he was, in the alley again, as I was going to the apartment lobby. He pointed his sword at me. Then he ran up the fire escape, and got away. I don't know where he is now. But he's dangerous. Please, if you see him, get help. Find me. Story 20, LEV, Ghoul. So here I am, doing my job, and I find this phone. The last child on this elevator went scurrying out of here like Satan was on her ass. And maybe he was. She had the internet browser open to this site and I read a few of the posts on the elevator game. My demon. God. What the hell are you people thinking? You play this game and think the other dimensions are going to be nice to you? Don't worry about the girl I got this phone from, she will be fine. Unless she tries to cross the desert in this dimension. Okay, so I should explain something about myself. I am LEV, Ghoul, not my birth name, obviously. I am the creepy lady who gets on the elevator at the 5th floor. Of course there is more than just me. I cannot terrorize everyone, not ghoulishly possible. I was not always a ghoul. I had a nice little life in Japan in the 1800s. Then I went and dishonored my family. Long story short, this is my life now. No, I do not want to talk about it. I have been doing this job for about 100 of your years. I do not get a vacation, I do not get overtime, I do not get days off. I just get on the elevator, get off the elevator, turn around, literally, and get back on. Occasionally I bend the rules about more than one player. I do not really know until the doors open if there is one person or two. I, however, have nothing to do with if your ritual works or not. If you do it correctly, I show up. If you do not do it right, then you are SOL. I do take time for a lunch break, it may be a short one, but a ghoul gets hungry too. I can change my appearance, so if I can be blonde, white, 6 feet tall with purple skin, red eyes and yellow polka dots, whatever I feel like at the moment. I can be visible or invisible, silent or chatty. Sometimes I poke people to get them to interact with me, some people I leave alone. Those who I do get to interact with me, I get to keep. I usually keep a person around for a few of my days, or until they bore or piss me off. Then I go all Hannibal Lecter on their asses. Ha ha ha, that was a good one. Then I eat them. I am a ghoul. What did you thinking I did? Play tittywinks. I have learned about your world from these idiots. Everything from trains, planes, automobiles, world wars, to the latest trends on TV, music, fashion and pop culture. That is how I learned about cell phones. That is how I learned the elevator game was more than just Asia. See, most of the people up until the mid-1990s were some type of Asian, Korean, Japanese, Chinese or anywhere where there was an elevator and the correct sequence. Then people start getting whiter and different. I tried talking to them in Japanese, nothing. I tried waving, nothing. I once tried taking off my shirt, and stood in the doorway topless, that guy broke. Oh my goodness, that one was so funny. I still get the giggles thinking how nummy he looked. Whimpering and sobbing in the corner of the elevator, and when the door dinged open, he tried to run me over to get out. Wow, it's been so long since I have laughed so much. I kept him around for a while. He told me about the internet and how he heard of this game from a friend and thought it was bullshit. He told me about a new music media, CDs, and even shared some marijuana with me. That just made me have the munchies, as he called it. I knew he wanted me to let him go. I still ate him. I think I will keep this phone. The dimensions here have universal, haha, chargers, and I am just going to assume the Wi-Fi is interdimensional. If not, then I am totally sure I will be around your neck of the woods again soon. Now I think I will go find that poor girl. I am peckish.